Antonio Negri. Marx Beyond Marx. Lessons on the Grundrisse. Translated by Harry Cleaver. Michael Ryan and Maurizio Viano. Editor's Preface. This is an English translation of one of the most crucial documents in European Marxism series. Well, since maybe ever. The work of Antonio Negri, as part of the variegated movement on the Italian left known most easily as autonomia, brings to realization an overwhelming new set of possibilities in the theory-arid practice of class struggle. No political movement in the world in the 1970s opened up more revolutionary potential for liberation than the Italian autonomia, and no expressions of its history exceed Negri's in transformative power and conceptual brilliance. This book, as nearly all of Negri's works, is intellectually demanding and often feels, to the casual reader, hermetic, precious and obscure. Partly, this is due to a set of counter-themes precise and exact, but novel that the experienced Marxist reader will find transgressive but revelatory. Partly, too, the difficulty of the book can be located in Negri's understanding of and respect for the political efficacy of language itself, an insight and attitude which may be the most common heritage of the post-war waves of structuralism, semiotics, and their antecedents. But partly this struggle to read induced by Negri is something like a process that might be called in a metaphor of simultaneous separation and coherence-conversion. The change overturning, reversal, supersession, inversion makes all the difference. But according to Negri, what's beyond is still, or finally, just Marx. This book is the product of a series of seminars given by Negri in the spring of 1978 at the École Normale Supérieure at the invitation of Louis Althusser. More about this can be read in the author's own preface to the original edition, which to the American reader. The translation into English from the 1979 French and Italian editions was accomplished by Harry Cleaver, Michael Ryan, and Maurizio Viano. Each of them has written something for the reader of this volume. Harry Cleaver has aimed primarily at the militant and activist audience, and helps to point out the immediate and direct political consequences of Negri's work for present currents in the U.S. movement. Michael Ryan, in a broad summary of Negri's other work, offers a theoretical and historical context for autonomia, particularly for readers previously unexposed to this tendency. Maurizio Viano provides a suggestive gloss on politics as creating, or imagining, or ficting, with some hints about the redundancy, or monotony, or co-optive centrality of scientific texts, socialist above all others. Readers inclined to move toward these pieces first should do so at once, and read in any direction they choose. I will continue here with a brief glossary of some key terms, acknowledgements, and a note about texts cited in this book. But, owing to its absence elsewhere in English, and its usefulness for the events in the life of Negri subsequent to the composition of Marx Beyond Marx, a brief biography may be in order. Antonio Negri was born in 1933 in Padua, Italy. At age 23 he graduated with a degree in philosophy and with a dissertation on German historicism. For the 2 years following, 1957–58, he studied with Chabad at the Benedetto Croce Institute for Historical Studies in Naples. In 1959, quite young, by Italian standards at that time, he won a professorship in philosophy of law. Until 1967, he was an assistant teaching at Padua, and in that year he won the professorship in doctrine of the state. Married to Paolo Mio, Negri became father in 1964 to a daughter and in 1967 to a son. At Padua, beginning in the late 1960s, a group of reputable scholars began to form, coming to include Sergio Bologna, Luciano Ferrari Bravo, Ferruccio Gambino, Guido Bianchini, Sandro Serafini, Elisa Del Re, and Matarosa Dalla Costa. Their presence made the Institute for Political Sciences a national and international crossroads for radical thought. In addition to his academic life, Negri maintained an intense political and journalistic commitment. By 1956 he was already the director of Tubo, the Journal of Student Representation at Padua University. In 1959, Elected a municipal councilman for the Italian Socialist Party, he directed the journal of the Padua section of the party, Tu Progresso Veneto. He held this post until 1963, the year of the first center-left coalition, when he also left the Socialists. The summer of 1963 had been hot. Veneto had undergone a rapid transformation from sleepy rural village into an urban, industrial center. In a period in Italy in which the Communist Party had turned towards external objectives, the Italian working class was barely unionized and hardly organized. But it was among these workers that Negri had begun to move. In August 1963, a supplement to Tu Progresso Veneto was issued entitled Potere Operaio. Also in that month, Negri, Paolo Mio and Massimo Cacciari organized a course to read Marx's Capital among the workers of the Porto Marghera Petrochemical Center. In the same period, Quaderni Rossi was started in Turin, but with editorial boards also in Milan, Rome and Padua. Quaderni Rossi was the magazine that, under the direction of Raniero Panzieri and Romano Alquati, first gave voice to the theory of working class autonomy. Negri, Sergio Bologna, Mario Tronde, Alberto Azzarosa, and many other oft-best Italian left intellectuals participated in its publication, and out of splits in Quaderni Rossi there later appeared, in order, Class Operaia, Contropiano, and other journals addressing the same conceptual fields. By 1967, Potere Operaio had become the journal of the workers at the large Marghera petrochemical plant. Negri's collaboration there led to later collaborations on a regular basis with many other publications, like AUT, the philosophy journal edited by Enzo Paci, and Critica del Diritto, the journal of the democratic magistrates, which publishes essays on the philosophy of law. The tumultuous year 1968, which brought near revolution to France, began in Italy in 1967 and stayed for nearly a decade. Contrary to the experience elsewhere in Europe, where students and workers flirted but parted ways, in Italy the student and workers' struggles merged. By the hot autumn of 1969, Negri had focused his political activities around the massified factory and around issues seldom adequately addressed by the unions: safety, reduction of speed on the assembly lines, worker discipline. The fall season of 1969 brought the formation of a number of groups to the left of the Italian Communist Party, with names like Lotta Continua, Avanguardia Operaia, Movimento Studentesco, and Potere Operaio. This political formation, after its journal, claimed Negri as its most famous theoretician. This group would survive until 1973, when under the impetus of the Communist Party's historic compromise strategy of alliance with the ruling Christian Democrats it led a number of similar but less developed groups into auto-dissolution. By 1973, many of Negri's basic concepts had been formed, and it is from this period that the birth of autonomia can be fixed, beginning with the autonomous committees inside the factories, which were now in large measure filled with a younger and more militant generation of workers, restless and hostile to all codified ideologies and parties, left or right. The refusal of the organizational forms born out of the 60s, now widely held to be sterile and repetitive, and the definition of new needs and objectives for liberating everyday life from labor time, were the themes that united disparate autonomous groups otherwise very different in their practices. Women's groups, students, workers, radical youth, cultural figures, ecologists, and environmentalists, autonomous collectives proliferated at the margins which remained invisible to traditional working class analyses. Free radio stations like Radio Alice in Bologna played a large role in the so-called Spring Rebellion, which brought many of these autonomists into the streets in protest of the politics of austerity and sacrifice that everybody, including the unions and the Communist Party, demanded of the working class. This protest touched Negri close to home. Demonstrations and rallies at the university in Padua brought disorder and much destruction, including materials housed in the Institute for Political Sciences. When the protests spread to other areas of the city, Negri was charged with inciting to riot and accused of being the fomenter of violence even up to the national scale. It was precisely at this time that Negri, in the face of intense political pressure and criminal charges, fled to Paris and the École Normale. Though in the later months of 1977 he was cleared of these charges, and by the year's end had returned to teach at Padua, Negri spent much of 1978 to 79 living and teaching in France. Marx Beyond Marx shows all the signs of this period of tumult, but the subsequent months would have much more in store. Returning to Milan from France in April of 1979, Negri was arrested on unspecified charges in the context of the investigation of the death of Edo Moro at the hand of the Red Brigades, another of the new groups formed in Italy in the 1970s, but one with which Negri had had no visible association. While many of the members of the Red Brigades could be identified in previous formations like Potera Operaio, the elite-style tactics and perspectives of the armed commando organization apparently had little in common with the participatory, autonomous movement groups. By the time Marx Beyond Marx was published, its author was in prison, charged with subversive association, although a number of other more grievous charges occupied the headlines of Italian newspapers. Nearly 24 professors, writers, journalists, and other people identified with the Autonomia movement were arrested the same day Negri was, and soon found themselves being heralded as the secret brains behind the Red Brigades and virtually all terrorist actions which had occurred in Italy in the previous decade. In Negri's case, an early prosecution effort sought to claim that Negri's voice could be heard on a tape recording of a phone call made by the Red Brigades to Mrs. Moro while her husband, the former Prime Minister of Italy, was a kidnapping hostage. The April 7 arrests, and particularly Negri's, were a media sensation and soon a cause célèbre. Italy has, as a remnant of fascist legislation, never successfully or completely replaced provisions allowing for pre-trial detention in normal procedures lasting as long as 12 years. As the weeks and months awaiting trial stretched on, speculation increased that the penal system in Italy was being subjected to abuses of a political nature. There was little question in anyone's mind that Negri was a supporter of politics far to the left of the Italian mainstream, and even of the Communist Party, as any of Negri's writings would show. But the evidence, judicial and legal, of criminality was not forthcoming. Negri remained in prison until the summer of 1983, when, in a campaign organized by the Radical Party, he received sufficient votes in a national election to lead the Radical Party list in the Italian parliament. Another provision in Italian law, largely untested, allowed prosecutorial immunity to members of the parliament, and following contentious debate Negri was freed. He addressed public meetings in Italy in the late summer of 1983, while further parliamentary discussions took place over whether or not he would actually be seated. Finally, in September of 1983, as debate turned against him and he feared being returned to prison, Negri disappeared. Throughout the fall of 1983 and early 1984, it was widely believed that he had returned to Paris. Depending upon how one views political exile, the Antonio Negri of 1984 is either, or both, the prisoner or free man of his preface to the American edition of Marx Beyond Marx. A number of terms may be of use to readers unfamiliar with the general vocabulary of the Autonomia movement. Owing to the distinct political traditions by region in Italy, and the workers' offensives resulting in the early 1960s from southern migration, the Quaterni Rossi quite early began attending to the new composition of the working class. Against the term hegemony, which implied a static and passive working class determined by its relations to capital, class composition refers to the process of socialization of the working class, and the extension, unification, and generalization of its antagonistic tendency against capital, in struggle, and from below. This search for a new, collective, working class subject, or agent of historical change, led to an attention to cycles, or progressively higher, more socialized terrains of struggle, marked by different compositions of the class, different relations to organizational forms like parties or unions as well as new strategic contents or goals of the revolution. Since many of the organizational forms addressed to the mass worker in the 1960s were seen as fully within the Keynesian strategy of planned development, socialist productivism, and the value of labor, autonomy from the mediating forms of parties and unions was seen to respond to the present cycle, one based on struggles against the extension or full socialization of capitalist relations beyond the factory, or struggles against the social factory or social capital. If socialism was the realization of productive labor, in the Soviet phase, that led only to the planned development of productive forces, or capitalist socialism. The latest cycle, however, would take as its goal the realization of needs, and this would come through the refusal of work. If work by the worker was the source of surplus value for the capitalist for Marx, labor has no value outside of capital. Working class autonomy indicated the present path of departure or separation for the anti-capitalist struggle, one based not on the general social interest of need subordinated to labor, but antagonistic to and against the social whole. This tendency, through the refusal of work, was the overall orientation toward the strategy of imminent communism. In the absence of this strategy at the cycle of the struggle, communism could be indefinitely deferred. The movement toward communism would be a class cell/valorization, one occurring as a struggle for reappropriation of the class material self-interest. Capital's response is, through the managed crisis, to revalorize work through social command, i.e., to enforce the wage-work nexus and unpaid surplus work over society by means of the state. This involves the social worker, the extension of the mass worker into the sphere of the social reproduction of capital, or into reproduction. Battles here take place over unpaid labor, housework, schooling, capitalist forms of sociality, anything which bears the work relation without the wage. In the productive sphere or in the factory, the struggle is for the political wage, or away from hierarchical or divisive forms of qualification or remuneration. The way in which capital manages the crisis as a means to forcibly reimpose the wage-work relation is referred to as the crisis state. This is a cursory introduction to a number of difficult and exacting concepts, and while it may help the reader through some passages of the present volume, it can hardly substitute for serious reading in the larger literature of autonomia. A bibliography of Antonio Negri's major work and of English language work on autonomia is found at the back of the book. Most readers might be best served by consulting first, for further reading or for assistance with this book, the fine anthologies edited by the Conference of Socialist Economists and Red Notes in Britain and by Semiotext in New York. The citations to the Grundrisse in this translation are to the Penguin Books edition, translated and with a foreword by Martin Nicholas, published in Middlesex, England, and New York, as well as Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Citations occur in the form, the second-page citation in each case is to the German edition of 1953 published by the Dietz Verlag, Berlin. Citations to Capital are to Volume 1, introduced by Ernest Mondel and translated by Ben Fowkes, Vintage Books edition, New York. Where it has been published in English, the Marx/Engels correspondence cited in the text is from Saul K. Padover, The Letters of Karl Marx, 1979. Where unavailable elsewhere, we have provided our own translation. Citations to Rostalski are to Roman Rostalski, The Making of Marx's Capital, translated by Pete Burgess, 1977. Other citations from the Italian edition remain as cited by Negri himself, Vitali Vygotsky, L'introduzione et Grundrisse de Marx, La Nuova Italia, Firenze, 1974, Sergio Bologna, Moneta e Crisi, Marx correspondent della New York Daily Tribune, in Bologna Carpignano Negri, Crisi e Organizzazione Operata, Feltrinelli, Milano, 1974. The circumstances of the writing of the original perhaps necessitated a casual attitude toward some lesser references, and we have not sought to document further what the author felt no obligation to do himself. In this judgment, and in other matters generally about the merit of this edition, I bear the primary responsibility. I would like to acknowledge here a number of people who were crucial to the work on this book. The greatest debt is owed the three translators, Harry Cleaver, Michael Ryan, and Maurizio Viano. Harry Cleaver also produced the index and did most of the proofreading. Sylvie Coyod helped with innumerable matters related to publication rights and agreements. Jim Bergen of Bergen and Garvey Publishers was a prime mover in seeing the book to completion, as well as being committed to the subject itself. Ferruccio Gambino, Silvia Federici, George Kafantzis, and John Downing helped with translations problems, interpretations, gave advice or commiserated. Peter Bell produced a draft on which much of the bibliography could be based. Peter Linnebaugh helped conduct relations with Red Notes and the Conference of Socialist Economists in London, and Ed Emery and Leigh Levidow were better correspondents concerning this volume than was I. I also owe to Red Notes and CSE much help with material. The edition of Semio text edited by Silvero Latringer and Christian Marazzi was instrumental in getting the project off the ground. And Lwan Jones made the project possible from the outset. The bibliography of works in the autonomist Marxist tradition has been revised, extended, and updated for the Autonomedia I Pluto paperback edition. The author remains in exile in Paris, where he continues writing, teaching, and organizing. Additional thanks for assisting with this new edition go to Ann Beach, Roger Van Zwanenberg, Michael Hart, Brian Masumi, and Gayatri Spivak. In these lessons I collect all the materials that I used for 9 seminars on the Grundrisse at the École Normale Supérieure in the spring of 1978. First of all, I must thank Louis Althusser for inviting me to teach the seminar, which wouldn't have been possible without the fraternal help of Roxanne Silbermann, Jan Murier, Daniel Cohen, Pierre A. Wenzik, Daniel, and Alain Guillerme. Whether my suggestions have been more important than their critical interventions, I don't know. It is certainly true that I have fused everything together into the text. Other discussions have been useful to me during my stay in Paris. On the one hand I would like to thank Felix Guattari for all that he gave me, and on the other hand the comrades for whom I worked at the Université Paris Septième. Last but not least I want to thank those blockheads who, forcing me to emigrate, have also forced me to gather together my ideas better than I had the chance to do before. A.N. Milan, 1978. 2. Dear English language readers. You ask me to rethink for a moment Marx beyond Marx. These are notebooks for lessons that I taught in the spring of 1978 at the École Normale in Paris. It seems to me as though a century has passed since then. Looking back at 14. The book, I like it. But it is as though another person had written it, not I. A free person, while I've been in jail for centuries. I must then engage in a supreme act of abstraction in order to talk with the author of that book. The author is free, I'm a prisoner. I will try anyway, with great effort, to provide a dialogue between a free man, the author of Marx Beyond Marx, and a prisoner. Free man, these lessons are just lessons, and they must be taken as a moment of reflection and of passage. Prisoner, this seems to me to be the case. It looks to me that when you were considering this passage and experience, it is as though they were very near, as though communism were already a living substance. Free man, certainly. I still think that these lessons have many limits, but also a fundamental advantage, that of being fresh, non-polluted. This freshness might have led to an important development in the analysis, to a lush ripeness. Prisoner, a transitional work, then. But where did you want to go? Where would your revisited Marx have led you? Free man, beyond the disfiguration of Marxism operated by Marxists. Marxism shows Marx as a professor and not as a militant. Moreover, Marxism shows us Marx as the author of the old competitive capitalism, incapable of coping with the social capitalism of the present stage. I hate this betrayal as much as I hate the mummification. Prisoner, I agree with you, and with your motives. But is it possible? Free man, Marx takes up the classic theory of value, but above all we find in him the critique of the law of surplus value. But Marx is not a classic, he is beyond all that. Prisoner, but the critique of the law of value, insofar as it presents itself as the law of surplus value, leads to catastrophism. Isn't yours just one extremist variant of Marxism? Free man, the critique of the law of value and / or surplus value has undoubtedly had catastrophist connotations, but these catastrophist connotations are kept at bay in Marx Beyond Marx, where what is insisted upon is the definition of the subjectivity of the passage to communism, as a process that develops concomitantly with the crisis of the law of value. Prisoner, I am probably in jail because I haven't understood this very well. Do you want to try to explain it to me a little better? Free man, certainly. Marx's Grundrisse founds and undoes the law of value. In the Grundrisse, Marx appears as a communist militant who forces the theoretical limits of the classical analysis of value, and who justifies communist hope. He does not deceive himself as to the immediacy of the process, but he does clarify its subjective necessity. And you, my prisoner friend, are being a smart ass. If you didn't agree with this, why would you then endure prison? Prisoner, I don't like argument ad hominem, always easy for those who are on the outside. In reality, here in jail, I am certainly subjected to both the law of value and the law of surplus value. Concretized in an immense system of domination, they wait on me in an unbearable way. Free man, that of course is just what's said in Marx Beyond Marx, and I don't understand how you fail to realize that. The capitalist supersession of the law of value, what Marx calls the process of real subsumption, dislocates the relations of exploitation as a whole. It transforms exploitation into a global social relation. Jail equals factory. Prisoner, I don't need to be persuaded that the world is a prison, but how to get out of it. Free man, the great problem that is posed in Marx Beyond Marx is that of the definition of antagonism in this real subsumption. What does it mean to struggle against capital when capital has subjugated all of lived time, not only that of the working day, but all of it? Reproduction is like production, life is like work. At this level, to break with capital is to a prison break. Prisoner, it seems to me that these so-called postmodernist theories disclose the social potency of capital, but by recognizing that capital occupies the whole of society, they deny the possibility of class struggle at this level. Free man, the postmodernists mystify. In reality, the operation of real subsumption does not eliminate the antagonism, but rather displaces it to the social level. Class struggle does not disappear, it is transformed into all the moments of everyday life. The daily life of a proletarian is posited as a whole against the domination of capital. The real subsumption, far from eliminating the antagonism, immensely enriches it. Prisoner, okay, critique of the law of value, its effectiveness only at the level, the simultaneous displacement of domination and class struggle. Look, practically, how does all of this work? Free man, it works on the totality of everyday life, my life against yours, you dog of the social master. My time against yours. All the problems of exploitation are by now immediate political problems. Only when we keep in mind the critique of surplus value within the framework of the real subsumption, only then do we have the capacity for submitting to a communist critique the present fundamental plans for domination. Prisoner, class antagonism in the postmodern world. Maybe you're right. Then it means, at this point, filling with a material content the struggle against power. Free man, precisely. In the conviction that the struggle against the capitalist organization of production, of the job market, of the working day, of the restructuration of energy, of family life, etc., all of this involves the people, the community, the choice of lifestyle. To be communist today means to live as a communist. Prisoner, this, I think, is possible even in prison. But not outside, at least until you free us all. Free man, you're right. Marx Beyond Marx says this, too. But don't pretend to total impatience when you know very well that theory allows you to cope. End of dialogue. Those who feel they remain alone naturally hope. Hope of having said the truth, and that the truth is revolutionary. An embrace for you all. A.N. Rebibia Prison. Introduction. First and foremost, Antonio Negri's Marx Beyond Marx is a book for revolutionary militants. Formally, the book is a reading of Marx's Grundrisse, a sweeping reinterpretation of the central thrust and particular developments of Marx's 1857 notebooks. But it is more than that. Marx Beyond Marx is above all a passionately political work designed to present an alternative to orthodox interpretations of Marx by demonstrating how the Grundrisse contains a Marxist science of class struggle and revolution in action. To accomplish this demonstration, Negri weaves together a fierce polemic and a detailed examination and reinterpretation of the text itself. Marx Beyond Marx is a difficult book, and its difficulty creates the danger that its study will be limited to academic Marxists. This would be tragic. We have edited and translated this book, not to contribute another volume to the shelves of English-speaking Marxists, but to put a new and exciting weapon into the hands of working-class militants. However difficult Marx Beyond Marx may be, and its difficulty stems both from the raw complexities of the Grundrisse itself and from Negri's own theoretical language, its study is more than worth the effort to any militant seeking new ways to understand and use Marxism to come to grips with working class struggle in the present crisis. For Negri, the Grundrisse represents the summit of Marx's revolutionary thought, a summit that can provide a powerful foundation for revolutionary political practice. He contrasts the Grundrisse to capital, which, he correctly points out, has often been interpreted in an objectivist and determinist fashion to justify reactionary politics. Negri argues that it is harder to do this with the Grundrisse, lamenting the absence of analysis there, dismissing other pieces as philosophical lapses and marking many instances of ambiguity and of limitations to the analysis. It does become obvious that Negri has pieced together an interpretation of the major lines of Marx's argument through his own selective process. But we should not be afraid to pick and choose among Marx's ideas. This is what Marxists have always done, whether they are honest about it or not. Traditional Marxists have always focused on the objectivist elements of Marx because that fit their political proclivities. Critical theory seems to have ignored Marx's theory of the working class as subject because of a deep-seated pessimism acquired in a period of crisis. For those of us who share Negri's commitment to the constant renewal of revolutionary practice, we can focus on those elements of Marx that inform the analysis of our own struggles. Several generations of Marxists have given us the habit of perceiving the mechanisms of domination. What we need now is to use Marx to help us discover the mechanisms of liberation. We can leave to Marxologists the debate as to whether Negri is right about what Marx really meant. We can read Negri for Negri, and judge the insightfulness of his comments on their own merits. When, at the end of chapter 5, Negri questions the correctness of his interpretation, we are tempted to say it doesn't matter. If Marx did not mean what Negri says he did, so much the worse for Marx. This, it seems to me, is the only spirit that can take us along Marx's path in such a way that we can indeed go beyond Marx. Negri's reading of the Grundrisse is what I call a political reading, in the sense that his work tries to show how each category and relationship examined by Marx relates to and clarifies the antagonistic nature of the class struggle. At the same time, here is the domain of his polemic. He examines the meaning of the analysis for the political strategy of the working class. From the earliest chapters of Marx Beyond Marx, in his examination of Marx's analysis of money as a critique of power, we recognize that for Negri there is no separate political sphere in Marx. Understood as the domain class struggle, politics is omnipresent, all of the categories are political. There is no need to riffle Marx Beyond Marx looking for the political passages. Every line is a political moment. There is a political excitement here that carries the reader forward, through the more difficult passages, toward ever more concrete analyses of the class struggle. This approach is radically different from traditional Marxism, which has always treated politics as one subject among others, especially distinct from economics, and often carefully tucked away in the attic of the superstructure. Over the years, Marxism has been all but sterilized by being reduced to a critique of capitalist hegemony and its laws of motion. The fascination of Marxists with capitalist mechanisms of despotism in the factory, of cultural domination and of the instrumentalization of working-class struggle has blinded them to the presence of a truly antagonistic subject. The capitalist class is the only subject they recognize. When they do see working-class struggle, it is almost always treated as a derivative of capital's own development. The true dynamic of capitalist development is invariably located in such internal contradictions among capitalists as competition. Negri's reading of the Grundrisse is designed to teach at this time. Theoreticians like Negri began to speak of the end of the law of value, of the replacement of capitalist exploitation by capitalist dom. In Adon, the snuggle was now purely political. The capital-labor nexus was no longer defined by the democratic model of exchange, but instead by a direct relation of force. At this point as well, Negri began to formulate the concept of the social worker, made up not only of industrial workers, but also of youth, students, under and unemployed. The political or social wage became the hinge for bringing together factory workers and unemployed. This formulation of a different revolutionary subject was seen as necessary because the emphasis on industrial workers' wage struggles during the 60s was made ineffective by the capitalists' use of inflation, the raising of the costs of reproducing labor power. Hence, the struggles had to be broadened to include the self-reduction of energy costs, political shopping, public spending, services. The sphere of reproduction became a terrain of struggle. In addition, the new strategy was meant to counter the CPI ideology of productive labor, which meant that the party supported capitalist development because it eventually led to the betterment of productive workers. The sector of under and unemployed were ignored by the party, which accepted austerity programs for the sake of greater efficiency for more capitalist development. There were no major developments until 1975, a watershed year which marked the defeat of autonomy's old slogans. The call for more money for less work no longer succeeded because the level of power of the workers diminished. Inflation and escalating unemployment were taking their toll. In addition, new levels of repression were reached, and an attempted coup made fascism seem a real alternative. A new social subject emerged, epitomized by the neo-hippie metropolitan Indians. This subject was characterized by an emphasis on drugs, communes, needs, and alternate forms of survival. It rejected discipline, leadership, and theory. Along with the women's movement, it marked a major departure from the traditional leftist model of organization. These developments provoked a change of line in the autonomy movement. The faction led by Negri was less Leninist, the one led by Franco Piper no more Leninist. Negri argued that it was no longer possible to bargain in the factory, one could only resort to force because the relation with the state was now a pure relation of force. He called for the direct takeover of the state. One should not bargain around work, he argued, but instead take over the factories, exercise counter-power by creating liberated zones that would free the productive forces and prefigure communism. The call to refuse work was muted because the law of value, the regulator of work, no longer held. Capital no longer needed workers because technology made workers dispensable. The importance of the strike was neutralized by the ability of machines to replace workers. Negri's new strategic formula was self-valorization, that is, working for oneself as a class, asserting one's own needs as primary to capital's need for value. In many ways, self-valorization gives theoretical expression to the programs of the newly emergent social subjects of the late 70s. The last great wave of militancy on the part of the autonomy movement occurred in 1977, the direct repression of the movement through the imprisonment of its leaders came in 1979. The extra-parliamentary movement, of which the autonomy movement is a part, is situated within the larger communist tradition, but it also marks a denial of that tradition. The important concept for understanding that denial is the refusal of work, which is directed in part against Leninism and Third International Socialism, which merely represents capitalist development in a different form. Autonomy, as a movement and as a theory, opposes the notion that capitalism is an irrational system which can be made rational through planning. Instead, it assumes the workers' viewpoint, privileging their activity as the lever of revolutionary passage and as that which alone can construct a communist society. Economics is seen as being entirely political. Economic relations are direct political relations between class subjects. And it is in the economic category of the social worker, not in an alienated political form like the party, that the initiative for political change resides. The word autonomy must be understood in light of this historical and theoretical context. It names a combination of rank and file radicalism with sphere of reproduction activism. The word autonomy at first named the independence and separation of the working class from capitalist development. By privileging itself, by valorizing its own needs, the class could subvert the valorization of capital, which is dependent on the subordination of workers. The word has acquired the additional meaning of that area of proletarian concerns, struggles, and organizations which is independent of the sanctioned institutions of the productive working class, the unions and the political parties. And, finally, autonomy names the chief characteristic of the subject in the communist society which it constitutes from its own multilateral productive potential. After Harry Cleaver has shown the militant weight of these 9 lessons, and after Michael Ryan has outlined the historical and textual growth of Negri's writings, both in his introduction and epilogue, I feel that my introductory task is less that of prescriptive information than of provocation. Astride an imaginary border between the US and Italy, I call forth the voices, or, better, some voices I hear coming feed'em both directions. Therefore this will be neither the offer of the most appropriate political reading, nor the offer of the connections between Marx beyond Marx and other cultural objects in the attempt to materialize a context, in the illusion of exhausting the totality of the determinations of the text. What is, in fact, the purpose of a context if not that of encircling a space where the pieces will all fit as if the articulations, at least the ones that matter in academic studies? We obtain the same result to which the inquiry concerning production and consumption leads if we consider the other relation, the relation between production and circulation. In this case equally, identity is split into difference, and difference is acknowledged as antagonism. The conclusion we reach is not that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption are identical, but that they all form the members of a totality, distinctions within a unity. In all stages of production there is a certain common quality of labor, social character of the same, etc. The force of social production develops later, etc. So the category of profit has its origin in the equalization of individual surplus values, in the simple units of surplus labor, but it develops, and ends in an ever closer approximation to surplus value, to social surplus labor. The critiques to the first Marxist definition of profit can be accepted as long as they do not claim a qualitative difference between surplus value and profit. Rather, the relation must be inverted. Profit is a category that tends towards surplus value insofar as it is a social relation. Beyond that, profit is a mystification and a category of the capitalist. As such, it is a further development of the inversion of subject and object which takes place in the production process already. Marx insists constantly on this formulation of the profit theory. On one hand, he critically stresses the fact that we must not see in the equalization of the rate of profit, which is to say in the constitution of profit by capital, more than it actually represents, a distributive phenomenon and not a creative one. He says ironically, if a single operation of exchange cannot increase the value of the thing exchanged, neither can a sum of exchanges do it. And he adds, it is altogether necessary to make this clear, because the distribution of the surplus value among the capitals, the calculation of the total surplus value among the individual capitals, this secondary economic operation gives rise to phenomena which are confused, in the ordinary economic books, with the primary ones. A secondary economic operation, then. And so, on the other hand, we can no longer be satisfied with following the theoretical and categorical order of the argument. It is a matter, rather, of beginning to define the dynamic, tendential, active figure of profit, the element of the socialization of exploitation in which the essence of profit constitutes itself and unfolds. Profit, therefore, is always that of lithe capitalist class. In this political figure of profit the tendency of the development is anticipated. Profit begins to concretize not only as the sum of surplus values and as the equalization of individual profits, but also as a political force, as a pole of social antagonism, political at this stage, but slowly ever more charged with reality. This passage is very important in that it represents the definitive demonstration that the theory of profit is subordinated to the theory of surplus value. The process leading to the political figure of capital is homologous with and contrary to the process that, in the theory of surplus value, led to the identification of living labor as the proletarian class. Certainly Marx developed a theory of profit, which is to say a theory of the subjectivity of capital, while in spite of his intentions he did not develop a theory of the subjectivity of the working class in the figure of wage, for instance. But this asymmetry of the literary development of Marx's work should not keep us from recognizing the structural balance, and from developing his proposed presuppositions, seeing in the social working day, in its division between social surplus labor and socially necessary labor, the basis for the deadly struggle that is put up by the two classes. We must see in these two spaces the formation of opposed subjectivities, opposed wills and intellects, opposed processes of valorization, in short, an antagonistic dynamism which is required by the very devil. Oppment of those conditions we have just considered here. A theory of the subjectivity of the working class and the proletariat constitutes then a presupposition and a duri vis avis tet.heory of .pr, fit, opposing reality of all the surplus labor extorted, objectified, so-claused, through WHLCH capital simultaneously has achieved its own unification as a class and the control of exploitation. The Grundrisse aims at a theory of the subjectivity of the working class against the profitable theory of capitalist subjectivity. Let's return, after this long digression, to the order of development of the Grundrisse, that is to the second section of the chapter on capital. This section formally begins with a long excursus on crises. Again the crisis, the present crisis, that critical reality which motivates the whole work and whose appreciation is its foundation. The Grundrisse had begun, in the emotion of the crisis, by fully exploring the theory of money as the privileged level of manifestation of the crisis. It developed then into the theory of surplus value and, through the first formulation of the profit theory and of the tensions implicit in the law of the profit rate, it returns again to the crisis and to its scientific explanation. Now, according to the preliminary plan, the process of capitalist production should make room for the analysis of the circulation process, and we should focus on this second thematic aspect of the Grundrisse. Marx's attention, however, is again arrested by the crisis. Before analysis unfolds extensively on it, circulation is seen exclusively as the form of the crisis. Does this new and lengthy dwelling upon the crisis represent a shortcut in the development of the Grundrisse? Is it an abuse of the order of theoretical procedure by revolutionary subjectivity? Partially, this is undoubtedly so. But it's also something more and something different. A large step forward had been made in the first part of the Grundrisse, and that is the subjectivization of the process. In other words, by virtue of the surplus value theory and its subsequent founding of the profit theory, we are now in possession of a conceptual network which allows us to bring into focus the crisis in its relationship with economic growth and class struggle. Unlike capital, which has no awareness whatever of the nature of its process of realization, and has an interest in having an awareness of it only in times of crisis, the point of view of the working class is by now capable of considering the growth in the form of the crisis and the crisis as the privileged territory of class struggle. The thought of the crisis, Marx's fixation, breaks in at this point, that is, when the process of capital's valorization should extend into circulation, but, as the process of valorization is dominated by the antagonistic law of surplus value, so the circulation process must be referred back to it and be grasped above all in this crisis, which attests to the continuity of antagonism as well as to its ever-present subjective impetuosity. So the second section of the chapter on capital, the real elaboration of the circulation process, does not begin in coincidence with the appearance of the title, but it begins only after the excursus on the crisis, about 100 pages later, or better still even later than that, after the excursus foremen, another 100 pages which, perhaps, represent a further expansion of Marx's interest in the definition of the crisis. The analysis of the crisis as the form of circulation is, then, a part of the fundamental analysis outlined by the surplus value theory. It is a research into the functioning of the antagonism which is proper to the production process in the crisis of circulation. The theory of surplus value therefore continues and undergoes a further definition in the crisis theory. The first part of the Grundrisse may be considered terminated only at the end of this excursus. Looked at precisely, that is, the realization process of capital and money becomes capital only through the realization process appears at the same time as its devaluation process, its demonetization. In any case, devaluation forms one moment of the realization process, which is already simply implied in the fact that the product of the process in its immediate form is not value, but first has to enter anew into circulation in order to be realized as such. Inside the production process, realization appeared totally identical with the production of surplus labor, and hence appeared to have no bounds other than those partly presupposed and partly posited within this process itself, but which are always posited within it as barriers to be forcibly overcome. There now appear barriers to it which lie outside it. In these pages the entire discourse on diachronic transformation becomes a discourse which constitutes class struggle in the modern sense. The articulations of production and reproduction, far from simply being the rigid terms of the determined social formation, represent the dynamism of class composition. The antagonistic dualism of development, which has been established so far around a sociological definition of compatibility and limits internal to the determined social formation, is now personified, that is, subjectivized. As the synchronic analysis of the crisis, in the excursus discussed above, had led us to consider the crisis as the product of class struggle, similarly this further development leads us to personify the actors of the relation of production as well as to consider both transformation and crisis as the products of the struggle between these subjects. With the analysis of the original accumulation, the concept of determined social formation becomes the concept of class composition. It restores, in other words, the dynamism of the subject's action, of the will that structures or destroys the relations of necessity. The die foreman has often been attacked as some kind of remainder, in the Grundrisse, of a theoretical attitude which would be both naturalistic and humanistic, which is to say some kind of transplant of the first pre-critical Marx, the young Marx, into his mature thought. We cannot but recognize a certain amount of pertinence to these critiques. The general law smells of philosophy of history and sociology. The analysis of the ancient world and Oriental civilizations is an actual piece of historical sociology. We must say, however, that both its ambiguity and generality progressively decrease the closer we get to the analysis of the capitalist world and original accumulation. Here the sociological terminology of the social formation and the internal criteria of compatibility and limit fade at first and dissolve thereafter into the dialectic of separation. Such a dialectic rarefies and annuls the initial humanism. The plenitude of needs and development is nothing but the plenitude of the rupture, the separation. But there is something more to it. For the first time the class dialectic not only shows its separate nature, but undergoes an implementation, a further specification and a superior meaning. It becomes a dialectics of subjects, and we cannot underestimate the political importance of this passage. We also come to understand the reason for this apparent interruption of the analysis on circulation represented by die foremen. Here, in die foremen, the concept of subject was to be intuitively constructed before its theoretical exposition in the analysis on circulation. It was, in other words, necessary to hint at and somehow prefigure the operation of displacement that the section on circulation had in store. Thus the chapter Die Formen is not an outgrowth in the Grundrisse, it's not an interruption of its development, on the contrary, it is both an excellent instance of method and of substantial process as well. The theme of the subject, in fact, is here introduced, which must form, and be formed, that relationship of struggle constituting circulation. And, mind well, the subject here has nothing to do with the aforementioned substantialist and humanistic presuppositions, rather it is the product of class struggle, it is the result of the relation between the workers' extreme alienation and revolutionary insurgents, a short-circuiting caused by the separation. The subject is here the explosion of that inversion which on the relation between difference and totality can interpret. It will be shown later that the most extreme form of alienation, wherein labor appears in the relation of capital and wage labor, and labor, productive, appears in relation to its conditions and its own product, is a necessary point of transition and therefore already contains in itself, in a still only inverted form, turned on its head, the dissolution of all limited presuppositions of production, and moreover creates and produces the unconditional presuppositions of production, and therewith the full material conditions for the total, universal development of the productive forces of the individual. Capital circulates in time and space, determining flows which are ever more coalesced, ever quicker temporally and ever more integrated spatially. The social conditions of production are formed, organized, and dominated by the organization of circulation, by the impulse capital gives to it. Therefore circulation is, above all, the expansion, the potency of capital, and for the same reason it entails the appropriation of all the social conditions and their placement in valorization. Even though circulation does not produce surplus value, it nonetheless enables capital to produce surplus value at every point of the circulation. The capitalistic appropriation of circulation, ever more totalitarian, determines circulation as the basis for production and reproduction until the limit is reached of a historical, effective identification of production with circulation. This pulling away of the natural ground from the foundations of every industry, and this transfer of its conditions of production outside itself, into a general context, hence the transformation of what was pre-superfluous into what is necessary, as historically created necessity is the tendency of capital. The general foundation of all industries comes to be general exchange itself, the world market, and hence the totality of the activities, intercourse, needs, etc., of which it is made up. Within a circulation so thoroughly invested by capital, labor itself comes to be unified, not only in that part which is directly expropriated and equalized by the rate of profit, but also in the part that constitutes necessary labor. The Vergleichung takes place in labor too. If the whole society is regarded as one individual, then necessary labor would consist the sum of all the particular labor functions which the division of labor separates off. The circulation of capital unceasingly transforms necessary labor into socially necessary labor. Circulation, then, invests capital and its components, with the result that capital achieves an internal homogeneity which constitutes an actual displacement of its category. The socialization of capital is a process which determines, through circulation, an irresistible compulsion towards expansion, appropriation, and homogenization under the sign of a social totality. The greater the extent to which historic needs created by production itself, social needs, eds which are themselves the offspring of social production and intercourse, are posited as necessary, the higher the level to which real wealth has become developed. It is necessary, however, to go a step further, at least in terms of clarification, which is to say that this process of socialization of capital cannot in any case be considered in a formal way. It represents a real process. Through circulation and socialization capital comes to be really unified. We must therefore begin to see the degree to which the real community has constituted itself in the form of capital. From the formal to the real subsumption, this passage entails the effective, functional, and organic subjugation of all the social conditions of production and, concomitantly, of labor as an associated force. The highest development of capital exists when the general conditions of the process of social production are not paid out of deductions of the social revenue, the state's taxes, where revenue and not capital appears as the labor fund, and where the worker, although he is a free wage worker like any other, nevertheless stands economically in a different relation but rather out of capital as capital. This shows the degree to which capital has subjugated all the conditions of social production to itself on one side, on the other side, hence, the extent to which social reproductive wealth has been capitalized, and all the needs are satisfied through the exchange form, as well the extent to which the socially posited needs of the, i.e. those which he consumes and feels not as a single individual in society, but communally with the other, whose mode of consumption is social by the nature of the thing, are likewise not only consumed but also produced through exchange, individual exchange. At this stage, the capitalist appropriation society is total. TF_E objectivity capital has been violently activated. Machines and science H1_VE ons futit. But the separation within the category has not been suppressed. The antagonism must reproduce itself at the highest level of power. The displacement of antagonistic dialectic must be tota hy revealed and operate at this stage. You can criticize all you like this way Marx has of via large tranches of argument which appear as relatively exterior one to another, this somewhat mechanical way of linking up the developments. We would sometimes wish to find a more interior, more subtle, more refined dialectic. We could skip these improvised displacements which emerge suddenly and leave us breathless, reminding us of the taste of a certain catastrophism. Yet, it seems to us difficult to imagine that we could develop a logical argument as powerful, or such an incredible capacity of prediction of capitalist development, in terms that would not be necessarily rigid but would still be strong, powerful, marked by an exceptional scientific tension. Here thought possesses such strength that it cannot be reduced to a simple caricature. The cleavage reappears and the process advances. The separation occurs within the process. But to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labor time and on the amount of labor employed than on the power of the agencies set in motion during labor time, whose powerful effectiveness is itself in turn out of all proportion to the direct labor time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and on the progress technology, or the application of the science to production. But from within the process where it was hidden, the separation is suddenly displaced to the outside and there takes the form of an independent subjectivity. In the conditions of the process described already, real wealth manifests itself, rather, and large industry reveals this in the monstrous disproportion between the labor time applied, and its, as well as in the qualitative imbalance between labor, reduced to a pure abstraction, and the power of the production process it intends. Labor no longer appears so much to be included within the production process, rather, the human being comes to relate more as watchman and regulator to the production process itself. No longer does the worker insert a modified natural thing as middle link between the object and himself, tather, he inserts the process of nature, transformed into an industrial process, as a means between himself and inorganic nature, mastering it. He steps to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor. In this transformation, it is neither the direct human labor he himself performs, nor the time during which he works, but rather the appropriation of his own genital productive power, his understanding of nature, and it is, in a word, the development of the social individual which appears as the great foundation stone of production and of wealth. The theft of alien labor time, on which the present wealth is based, appears a miserable foundation in face of this new one, created by large-scale industry itself. As soon as labor in the direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure, and hence exchange value. We have already read and commented on this passage for another point. We now want to reread it, to reverse it, convinced that this methodology can permit us to rediscover the directio of development of this new, too living contradiction that is the working class and the proletariat on the communist path. A path where each limit rigidity of the composition of class, determined level of necessary labor, etc. appears as an obstacle. But wherefore capital limits exist and are considered as obstacles only in order to found again limits and proportions, here, from the worker point of view, the limit appears as an obstacle in its proper sense, as coming from the other side. This manner of seeing is that of the antagonism, where the overcoming of the obstacle does not tend to create new limits but rather to develop most fully the use value and the power of living labor. In this passage, with this method, worker subjectivity becomes the revolutionary class, the universal class. In this passage, the constituting process of communism finds its Fuji development. We must immediately underline that in this light the antagonistic logic ceases to have a binary rhythm, ceases to accept the fantastical realiry of the adversary on its horizon. It refuses the dialectic even as a simple horizon. It refuses all binary formulae. The antagonistic process tends here to hegemony, it tends to destroy and to suppress its adversary. Deny the dialectic, that eternal formula of Judeo-Christian thought, that circumlocution for saying in the Western world rationality. In Marx we have read the most advanced project of its destruction, we have seen enormous steps forward in this direction. We must now engage ourselves completely. It is only on this terrain that we will be able to begin to speak of new categories, not of capital but for the overthrow of capital. Here, at the end of our work, it seems to me that we can consider as satisfied the intuition with which we began. We must liberate the revolutionary content of the Marxist method. The path of the Grundrisse offers for this a fundamental basis. Advancing within it, rediscovering the mechanisms which push Marxist thought forward, we arrive at last at the central point, the Marxist critique of all dialectical forms. It is there, finally, that we find the practical character of Marx's thought. The end of the dialectic? Yes, because the act of thinking here does not have any autonomy from the collective force, from the collective praxis which constitutes the subject as dynamism tending toward communism. The adversary must be destroyed. Only communist practice can destroy it, and must, accomplishing that and developing itself, liberating the rich independent multilaterality of communism. Epilogue. The theory of autonomy in Negri's other writings. Marx beyond Marx is more easily understandable when it is situated in the context of Negri's other writings on the theory and practice of autonomy, only a small number of which have been translated into English. Here, I will give an account of those writings and relate them to the themes of Marx beyond Marx. Workers and the State contains 2 essays by Negri, one of which, Marx on the Cycle and the Crisis, is crucial for an understanding of his later work. Here, in an embryonic form, one encounters several of the concepts which will be essential to the later, more elaborated theory of autonomy. The most important emphasis is the active role played by workers' struggle in determining economic development and its crisis. This once established, Negri can argue that workers already possess sufficient power to overthrow the capitalist state, since the state planning economy rests on a precarious antagonistic relation between capital and labor, in which labor plays the determining role. Negri reads the economy politically. What seems, in purely economic terms, an equilibrium is in fact a relation of antagonistic forces, what seems an objective structure is in fact the product of subjective activity. The economy is not a system of objective laws operating independently of social agents. It is, rather, an antagonistic relation between subjects. Thus, he argues that economic development is a problem and a project of capitalist power. Development is determined by the antagonism between capital and labor, more specifically by the relation between surplus value and the wage. That irreducible dualism imposes crisis as a necessity on capital. After 1917 and the example of Russia, Negri sees emerging an increasing autonomy of the working classes of Western Europe, and this calls forth responses on the part of the bourgeoisie to reorder this antinomy into an equilibrium. Keynes represents the promotion of development, based on the use of artificial instruments according to a formal model of equilibrium, as an alternative to crisis. Schumpeter, in his theory of business cycles, represents a political definition of development as a means of attaining class domination. Capital uses the crisis to rearrange the fundamental relation of forces. The cycle contains crisis as a function of its process. Negri finds both Keynes and Schumpeter foreshadowed in Marx's writings on the crisis. Marx sees capitalism's periodic cycles as containing necessary crises. Equilibrium is in a median or an accident, normal development is in fact the anormal possibility of crisis. More significantly, Negri emphasizes the active role Marx attributes to the working class in inducing crises. Marx argues that wage pressure produces a falling rate of profit and that this tendency is produced solely by competition between the classes. Negri adds that since development is dependent on the desire for profit, in the seemingly objective process of development one must read an antagonistic class relation, a political relation of force between subjects, in other words, not an objective law. The crisis of the falling rate of profit is the result of a relation of forces, of the tendencies and counter-tendencies of subjects in struggle. The working class raises the level of the necessary labor wage, and capital is constrained by this action to diminish the amount of living labor incorporated into production. The workers' struggle constitutes an irreducible limit to capitalist development. And even as capital uses the crisis to reassert the fundamental relation of forces, this merely displays the precariousness of capitalist development. The use of the crisis also realigns social segmentation - the political composition of the classes - and this radicalizes the class antagonism and extends it throughout society. Capital is irreducibly given over to this dialectic of development and crisis. The solution Negri sees emerging is the social planning state. Political violence and repression overcome the precariousness of capitalist economic development in a way which is not possible in mere economic practice. The organization of development has become the development of organization. Planning is central to this process. The more capitalism is planned and socially organized, the less it requires the crisis as a weapon. Because the planning state has become so necessary to capital, it must become an object of working class subversion. Negri bases this political cali on his previous economic argument. First, he assumes that worker power is already possible because of the determining role workers' struggles play in current capitalist economic development. He assumes the subjective determination of objective movements. Negri privileges mass actions over intuitive vanguardism. He recalls Luxemburg's concept of the workers' struggle as continuity of independent power, the vitality of irrepressible action. Negri occasionally speaks of the necessity of mixing Lenin and Luxemburg, and it is fitting that at this point he should also call for a rediscovery, on the part of the working class, of Lenin's emphasis on breakage, of violent rupture. This leads to the second economic basis for the political call to move against the planning state. If capital is dependent on development, which rests on a precarious fundamental relation, so that capital demonstrates the necessity of crisis for its own salvation, then breakage is both necessary and possible. Capital cannot have development except in the form of crisis, of an antagonism of classes which makes necessary the role of the planning state. Because it is founded on the forced closure of an irreducible antagonism, the state constitutes the weakest link in capitalism. It is the last resort of capital, and, hence, its breakage becomes the first recourse of workers' power. The other essay in Workers and the State is John M. Keynes and the Capitalist Theory of the State of 29. Negri sees 1929 as a fundamental moment in the development of the modern state. It was in many ways a response to 1917, a crisis which allowed capital to develop measures for controlling the working class. Taylorism and Fordism were designed to take Bolshevism away from the workers, but such measures only relaunched class composition on a higher level. A higher degree of control was needed, so that workers' autonomy could be channeled to serve the interests of capital. By assuming a Keynesian norm of equilibrium, capital merged the economic and the juridical, and made out any working class action which disturbed equilibrium to be illegal. The Keynesian instruments of state interventionism and the management of circulation turned of society into a factory. And economic development was assured by an alliance between the bourgeoisie and the socialists. Negri congratulates Keynes on recognizing the autonomy of the working class, but he points out a paradox in Keynes' attempt to use the working class for capitalist development. The attempt works not because the working class is always inside capitalism, but because it can always be outside. It always threatens to be outside, to assert its autonomy, and the political project of Keynesianism consists of recuperating this threat. Capital cannot do without labor, but the working class can do without capital. In Crisis of the Planning State, the central concern is the question of organization. It was writ at a time when the area of autonomy was beginning to hold national meetings in Florence and Bologna, partly to discuss the relationship between the spontaneous mass movement and the traditional workers' organization. Negri begins with an analysis of the way money reflects the irrepressible contradiction of capitalism, the antagonistic social relation upon which it is based. Money indicates capital's power over that relation in the form of the law of value. Since wage labor is the essential basis of production, money also points out the crisis of that domination. Rising wage pressure encroaches upon the seemingly independent operations of the law of exchange value. The myth of equivalence which conceals the extraction of surplus value cannot be maintained. The tendency of capital at this point, Negri argues, is to seek control beyond money, and this takes the form of planning. The rule of planning is broken by the emergence of the autonomy of the working class. Socialist planning should rise to a harmony which descends from the law of value to the determination of the social whole. This can only be given as the reduction of difference into unity. Nevertheless, irrationality cannot be expunged from the crisis of circulation. And, Negri argues, this is not simply a crisis of structural proportion, but a manifestation of the proportion between the classes, of their antagonism. Capitalist planning ultimately is impossible because of the heterogeneity of the organic composition of capital. The independence of the labor force is irrepressible, and this means that the relation between the extraction of labor value and profit must remain indeterminate. The recognition that capital cannot be determined apart from workers' struggles, from the actions of the total labor force, leads to the demand that capital overdetermine the system, as a mature rule of development. Keynesian socialism is a response to this exigency. Crisis is wielded to put limits on the productive force of labor, destruction serves the self-conservation of capital. Keynesianism becomes a permanent desire to block a potential development of the productive force of labor whose explosion could only mean the triumph of communism, conceived here in the terms Marx uses in the Grundrisse as the unfettered production of wealth and the consequent full development of each individual. Such a development would destroy capitalism by breaking the limits on production and on human development which the law of value requires. Overproduction and disproportionate wages reduce profit within the regime of the law of value. Hence, the permanence of crisis and of stagnation becomes a condition of the permanence of capital. This concept of productive labor, as the imminent possibility of communism and as, in consequence, a political threat to the law of value and to capital, is essential to the theory of autonomy. It is followed in the text by another essential concept, as capital attempts to recompose itself, to resolve in its autonomy the contradictions of practice, the contradictions reappear at a deeper level. The antagonism is irreducible, the totality of power of capital merely means that on the other side will stand the totality of power of a recomposed proletariat. The ultimate solution to this problem is its containment by the state. The tendency Negri sees at work in Italy in the early 70s resides in labor as a revolutionary subject, representing the unique source of wealth and the actuality of communism in its productivity, contradicted by capital's need to reduce the amount of living labor incorporated into production in order to counter the falling rate of profit. Socialism is thus impossible because no relation between labor and exchange value can escape being antagonistic. And communism is necessary as the untrammeled production which is subversive of the limits imposed by exchange value. Productive forces and social relations, which, for capital, are merely a means toward maintaining production on a limited basis, can become conditions for making this basis explode. What would emerge would be a communism where, as Marx put it, labor time would cease to be a measure of wealth, or exchange value a measure of use value. The theoretico-practical task which accompanies this assessment of the tendency implicit in the potency of the process of labor productivity is direct appropriation, as a practical recognition of the social conditions of production. Labor is already an immediate participation in the world of wealth, and to recognize this is to propose to the proletarian organization a necessary mass content for its program, the direct appropriation of produced social wealth by the producers. In the next chapter of Crisis, Negri addresses the relation between the workers' organization and the political composition of capital. The political composition of capital is characterized by the metamorphosis of the planning state into a crisis state marked by the free management of command for the survival of capital. The crisis state presents itself today as the crisis of the national state in relationship to the multinational corporation. With the demise of Keynesianism as a form of internal policy, the multinational corporation assumes the general command over development. This is in reaction to the actions of the mass workers. Capital reintroduces the division of labor against the mass worker. As massification was used in the 20s against the professional base of the workers' struggle, now selective participation is used against the mass base. The norm of the command over labor in the factory is spread throughout society. The political project of the proletarian organization must therefore break the political support of capital, the corporation and the factory. Just as earlier the assertion of autonomy was the proper character of class behavior against the planning state, of the proportion of necessary labor to surplus value, now direct social appropriation is the proper character of class behavior against the state of disvalue and of enterprise command. For Negri, the concept of the productive, creative, and inventive subject of labor is inseparable from the political task which derives necessarily from that concept. If labor is the living source of value and of wealth, and if exchange value cum enterprise command sets limits on the realization of that productive potential for wealth, then the concept of a revolutionary organization requires a consciousness of the growth of a new revolutionary subject, one rich in inventive potential, accompanied by a consciousness of the monstrosity of the rule of the law of value. This entirely political reading of the tendency implicit in capitalist economic development would see the class potential for invention as in itself destructive of capital's power. Capital attempts to contain labor, but only because it is itself contained by labor. For example, the arbitrariness of command reflects the destruction of the stability between the state and the unions, indicates the precariousness of the institutional functions of the state, and reveals the extreme condition into which the working class has put the state. The process which first saw the working class as entirely within capital, now sees capital as entirely within the working class. Along with the essay on Marx's theory of crisis, Negri's Workers' Party Against Work is a key text of the theory of autonomy. In it he discusses the problem of moving from the mass autonomous workers' movement to a workers' party organization. He begins with a definition of crisis, not as a mechanistic breakdown, rather as something which can only be understood in terms of the relations of force between the classes and their internal political composition. The crisis is caused by the developed composition of the working class. If capital depends on value extracted from labor, then crisis occurs when the working class no longer valorizes for capital. It is on the basis of an analysis of the relationship between crisis and working class action that the tasks of a workers' party organization can be determined. At this point, Negri praises Lenin's concept of the determinate social formation, but he also argues that the present-day working class composition requires a new concept of organization. Reformist organizations have blocked the continuity of organization within the class. The new organization must live the life of the class in an adequate way. Hence, although it is necessary to move from class composition to organization, the reverse must also be true. Negri next describes the coming into being of a mass working class subject as a result of the actions of capital in reaction to the worker-induced crisis of the falling rate of profit. As always, Negri's point of reference here is Marx's description in the Grundrisse of a communism of the direct appropriation by workers of the value they produce, thus abolishing the regime of value and of work. The falling rate of profit can be countered by increasing the mass of products, but this makes evident the contradiction between production and valorization, since not all the value of the mass of products can be realized. Too great a mass leads to a crisis of realization and overproduction. The resolutive mechanism of the capitalist process is broken by the necessary presence in production of a unified worker subject, the result of the massification of social productive forces in response to the falling rate of profit. This subject presents itself as a power which puts in increasingly drastic terms the possible alternative of the appropriation of the mass of products. The contemporary crisis is thus a combination of the falling rate of profit and the mass attacks carried out by a subject capital itself was constrained to construct in order to secure valorization. The working class has become a radical obstacle to capitalist development. As Negri puts it, the catastrophe of capital is the working class. The most important point here is the contradiction between the expansive mass productivity of labor and the limits capital must place on it in order to guarantee the realization of value. That massification of productive forces is already the communism Marx describes, only without the direct appropriation by workers of their product. What capitalists see as overproduction is simply communist production, an excess which guarantees a fully developed social individual and an end to the necessity wage work. But the massification of production also constructs the subject capable of breaking the constraints capital puts on this potential communism. Capital's reaction to the obstacle to profit which the working class poses is planning and reformism, but these fall apart as a result of stagnation and inflation, symptoms of the appropriation of profit by the new proletarian mass reunited in a productive subject. Beyond planning and reformism lies command, the logic of the power of the state, as capital's only recourse. The fall of value is the result of the struggles of the massified class, and value can only be restored by making the factory/enterprise into the moment of the complete recuperation of the social product. The command form of the enterprise is applied to all society. The enterprise state thus accepts crisis and recomposes itself on the basis of that crisis. Today, Negri goes on to argue, the fundamental character of class composition in Italy is the irreducibility of the autonomous actions of the class. He sees in the mass tendency to refuse work the movement from factory work to the tertiary or service sector, the spontaneous refusal of the regime of training for abstract labor, a prefiguration of Marx's description of communism as enjoyment not discipline, as the absence of work in free, creative activity. In relation to this, the unions and the reform parties merely constitute a redistribution of the law of value. Negri perceives the tendency which is in the process of realizing itself and the political needs which derive from the political class composition as being the unification of the class, the destruction of wage labor, and the political struggle for appropriation. On the basis of the two processes at work in the contemporary situation, the social massification of the productive forces and the imposition of the enterprise as the form of social organization. Negri concludes that the vanguard of the proletariat is the workers of the large factories, who are the principal object of exploitation and whose labor is most valorized. Because command has replaced the law of value as the means of assuring capitalist domination, the working class, in constituting itself as an organization, must develop a force of command and a capacity of violence equal to that of the padroni. Negri considers the possibility of a Leninist party, organized from above, and rejects it. The Leninist question of workers' alliances has been transformed into a problem of the unification along the internal lines of the proletariat, from below or inside, not from above. And because the refusal of work is taken as a given, the Leninist concept of the party as the director of a passage to socialism conceived as a higher organization of work must be rejected. Today, communism consists of the immediate use of accumulated wealth, outside and beyond any logic of the labor process. This is the express exigency of workers' power, as well as the direct cause of capital's crisis. Therefore, appropriation, the thematic of the contemporary workers' organization, comprehends the Leninist thematic of insurrection, as that which induces economic crisis and, potentially, breaks the political character of capital's control. It is a science, not an art. This identification of an economic activity appropriation with political power is another major principle of the theory of autonomy. The workers' organization now bases struggle not on the errors of the bosses, but rather on its own potential. Negri dislikes the word party for this new organization because it suggests the formal character of the Leninist party, its centralization, discipline, and division of labor. Nevertheless, the word should be used, he concludes, because it indicates the independence of the proletariat as an organization as well as the uninterrupted character of the revolution. At this point, he argues, the political task is to articulate factory struggle with struggles in the social terrain, wage actions with subversion. In addition, the vanguard and the mass process, Lenin and Luxemburg, must be combined. The concept of a vanguard party of the mass must unify the struggle for the wage and the revolutionary struggle for power. It must also include armed struggle, since the law of value, once it is stripped of its capitalist mystification, is revealed to be a law of terrorism, the violence of a mere relation of force. Because the state of law of the liberal tradition and the state of labor of the reformist tradition are impelled to transform the disaster of the falling rate of profit into the permanence of capitalist command, only armed struggle can revise the structure of power. At this point in Workers' Party Against Work, Negri proceeds to elaborate upon what he means by such an organization. A party based on the present political class composition cannot be a top-down Leninist organization, as we have seen. The composition of the ALAS is that of an independent variable in planning and an obstacle in development. The party, therefore, must undertake the reversal of the capitalist management of the extinction of the law of value from below, through mass actions. Because the working class, in its autonomy, is an obstacle to profit, the task of the party is to break the mystifying image which capital's power has over the class, to break its command. The growth of working class power in society is thus acknowledged as being inseparable from the affirmation of its power against the state. Because the autonomous activity of the class is based in material needs, the communist content of its political program is already expressed in absenteeism, sabotage, and direct appropriation. The party ceases its function of representation, it is no longer the consciousness of the class. The mass vanguards, already in the immediacy of their actions, contain the totality of revolutionary consequences which derive from them. These actions become organisms of workers' power which already expresses the program of communism. The party, therefore, is merely the executive organ of workers' power. It is the specular opposite of the capitalist process of valorization, its object of attack is the law of value as domination over labor, thus, it seeks to empower workers' autonomy as the communist power of non-work. This does not constitute, Negri insists, an old consecration of the party, rather, what is acknowledged is the paramount necessity of its function. With the state, the party should also be extinguished. And prior to that moment, the party is subordinated to the movement of the working class. Negri describes Lenin's Bolshevik Party as a party based on a class composition determined by the importance of the professional worker. It imposed the law of value and the discipline of the professional worker on the revolutionary movement. With the crisis of 1929, the period of the Central Party came to an end, and with it, the socialism of the professional worker. The impoverishment of the social composition of the working class in Europe, due to its massification after 1929, marks the beginning of a new practice of the party. The class vanguards at the level of the mass discover the use of the wage and the identification of democratic struggle with political struggle. For the center is substituted the circulation of the mobility of inexhaustible wage objectives and factory guerrilla warfare. All this derived from the new consciousness the class had in the socially planned economy. This gave rise to a new figure of unity, of an integral and autonomous subject, of the mass worker and of the vanguards of the masses. In reaction to this autonomy, that is, the slow erosion of profit capital, eventually developed the separation of command. On the basis of this configuration of political class compositions, the vanguard workers are not officers of a Red Army, but instead functions of workers' power. The more the working class constitutes itself as a social individual, the less there is a problem of power, the less party vanguard delegation is conceded. Worker recomposition is at this point directly political. The class management of its own power requires no mediation. The party is only an aspect of this necessity. The working class can use it, only when its activity dominates the party. The problem the movement faces, according to Negri, is that of bringing autonomy to the level of political direction. He describes three phases of the autonomy movement. During the first, in the 60s, there was a diffuse molecularity of struggles. This diffusion tended toward reunification in a party during the second phase in the late 60s. The third period consists of the building of institutions of attack for the party and of the attempt to build a cycle of armed struggle and appropriation. The problem at this is how to construct an organization without the fetishization of the party. Like other Italian theorists, Negri turns to the example of the IWW. Such examples show that liberation is not something which awaits communism, it can grow in the process of struggle as the form and the result of workers' power. The appendices published with Workers' Party Against Work are worth noting. One is entitled Theses on the Crisis, the Multinational Worker. Negri analyzes the right-wing attack against Keynesianism and the workers' response to it. That response aims at productivity and the division of labor founded on it. The capitalist counterattack takes place on the international level as monetary reorganization and the development of an international division of labor. The power of multinational corporations extinguishes the concept of national sovereignty and abolishes any notion of the autonomy of the political. Negri describes social democracy as the specific form of terror of the multinationals, the militarization of command over labor. He goes on to criticize the theory of state monopoly capitalism, which describes the internationalization of capital only in the market. This permits a fascization and isolation of internal national relations, as well as the development of revolutionary alliances with the bourgeoisie. The theory lacks any sense of international capitalist production, hence of an international proletariat. Failing to note the socialization of capitalist production, it sees centralization without socialization, and hence, the state seems fascist and technocratic. This leads to the claim that revolution is possible on a national basis through a strategy of democratic recomposition uniting all progressive forces. Negri calls instead for a multinational organization of workers and for the use of autonomy against social democratic terrorism. He thinks it is essential to use the weapon of the social wage, and to move from the factory to society. The wage struggle then becomes a struggle for appropriation and an attack on bourgeois property principles, as well as an attack on the process of profit realization in commodity circulation. Capital responds by segmenting labor and by curtailing the social wage. The factory is separated from society and the workers from the proletariat. Consequently, Negri emphasizes the importance of the marginalized proletariat in the struggle. Because the wage struggle encounters an increasing rigidity on the part of capital, the struggle is shifted to the terrain of reappropriation. And, Negri concludes, armed struggle becomes a necessity of the multinational worker. One step forward, two back, the end of the groups is a critique of the groups which formed in '68 and dissolved in the early '70s. These militants were too individualistic, according to Negri, and out of touch with the workers' movement. They lacked a theoretical analysis which could have linked them to the movement of the masses. Negri describes their history, from the spring of 1969 to the spring of 1973 and the occupation of the Fiat Mirafiori plant, in terms of three phases. The first phase was characterized by an autonomy of workers' actions. The project was unified as an identification with the object. The object was egalitarianism, and the movement itself was egalitarian. The refusal of the contract and the refusal of work became one. The vanguard was interchangeable with the mass. During the second phase, demands were extended to include the guaranteed wage. But the organizing process which sought to coordinate the discontinuities of the movement was broken. The groups of militants went on the attack without mass support and failed. The spring of 1972 marked the end of the groups, but the movement of proletarians and workers continued without them. It was at this time that the need for a continuous and organized conscious political relation was felt. The plant occupation at Mirafiori in 1973 marks out the third phase. Direction for the attack resided entirely within the movement. Negri reads the event as manifesting a unifying function which at this point began to form the nervature of an organization. Autonomy, as he puts it, began to write its own what is to be done. It is predicated upon the constant expansion of wage demands and the consciousness that the wage is power. And he points out that the newer young workers bring to the organization a new consciousness of the relation between wage struggle and the struggle for power, as well as between factory struggle and struggle in the community. It is in the final appendix Organizational Articulations and Whole Organization, the party of Mirafiori, that Negri offers an example of what he means by a workers' party. The problem he poses is that of the relation between the necessary disarticulation of the instances of attack and the level of workers' power of the whole organization. There can be no workers' concept of a party which does not involve the immediate exercise of power. In this light, it is necessary to demystify the neo-Leninist third internationalist concept of delegational representation. The Mirafiori occupation indicated an alternative, a party where the workers trust in their own mass power. Negri argues that this does not reflect spontaneism because the movement was informed and interpreted by the conscious initiative of the vanguards who staked out the terrain and provided direction. The need now is to attend to the continuous discontinuity of the relation between the moments of attack and the mass movement. And this is especially true in terms of moving from the factory to society, of joining the different functions of attack against capital's attempts at disarticulation. Finally, what Negri privileges in the Mirafiori experience is the mass character of the movement, that it was an immediately working class organization, that it was vertically integrated from the level of attack to the mass level, and that it had a directly political character as the exercise of power. Although not published until 1977, Negri's critical study of Lenin, The Factory of Strategy, which is in many ways a companion piece to Workers' Party Against Work, was originally a course of lectures given in 1973. Negri criticizes Lenin, but through a close consecutive reading of Lenin's writings, he also finds much that is of value to his own theory of revolution. Negri praises Lenin for correctly determining the form of political organization suited to the particular class composition of the Russian proletariat. But he also points out that the composition of the Italian working class is quite different, and this historical transformation makes necessary a new organizational strategy. By political class composition here, Negri means the determinateness of needs, actions, and levels of political consciousness that the working class as a subject reveals at a determined moment of history. Whereas Negri's referent is the revolutionary mass worker, Lenin's was the vanguard of industrial workers. The isolated and minoritarian status of that vanguard determined the necessity of an organization external to the proletariat. The diffusion of spontaneous struggle in Russia also made necessary a central party to unify the diverse struggles and to accumulate them into a more powerful and destructive force. For Lenin, the party is a factory because, Negri argues, of its capacity to act as a multiplier on the revolutionary spontaneity of the workers, turning this primary material of insubordination into a revolutionary accumulation, and transforming it into a general capacity of attack against the adversary. Workers learn the discipline and organization required for the party in the factory. Lenin's use of the analogy of the factory is thus representative of the technico-political composition of the class in Russia at the time. The composition of the class determined the need for external direction. and the underdeveloped condition of Russia determined that the struggle against exploitation should be a struggle for economic development. Negri defines Leninism as the capacity of a party, of a subjective will transformed into a collective brain, to assume workers' needs and to invert them, through adequate organizational means, from the impotence of demand into the force of attack, from the subversion of the state to the practice of power. Defined in this way, Leninism can be seen as a permanent feature of the Marxist political project. The contemporary political class composition of the Italian proletariat is rather different, and this means that a different form of organization is required. The working class is no longer isolated, the mass worker turns the abstractness of labor into a general, intersectoral, and territorial mobility. Also, planning has transformed the nature of capital control is no longer centralized, but instead extended beyond the factory to all society. The isolation of the Russian vanguard was determined by a large pre-capitalist sector, but today there is no outside to capitalism. For Lenin, all economic struggles are political, but political struggle is not only economic. Now, economic struggle and political struggle are identified completely. The move from particularity to generality, the economic to the political, loses all significance in the present context. Capital has conquered society, operating a real subsumption of labor, but in so doing it has developed a social individual directly capable of communism. It is possible now to read communism in the class. Lenin's party, on the other hand, belongs to the period of the merely formal subsumption of labor, and this imposed the necessity of further development before a class composition could be attained which was capable of communism. Today, Lenin's vanguard has become a vanguard of the mass. The concept of organization has become internal to class composition. This, Negri suggests, is a much more dialectical concept of the relation than Lenin's. But the modern party is defined by a higher level of class homogeneity. Whereas Lenin's party was delegational, there is no longer a need for representatives of the working das interests. Acting autonomously, the working class itself becomes an obstacle which constructs contradictions to capitalist development. On a more general level, Negri thinks that a revision of the concept of the party is necessary. The new party is a mass-determined organization, and he points for examples to the Paris Commune and the Mirafiori Occupation. The Russian Soviet as an organization of immediate workers' power, although it could not last in Russia, applies today because it indicates in the masses a possible source of legitimate power based on the activity of the masses. Lenin believed the Soviets should be mediated by the generality of the insurrectional process organized in a party. Today, the traditional party is no longer a solution. Now, there is a Sovietization of the masses against the decentralization of capital. In Lenin's time, the Soviets were characterized by two contradictions, that between the diffusion socialization of power and insurrection, and that between the Sovietism of the masses, that is, the socialization of workers' power, and the mediating organization of insurrection. Lenin could not solve these contradictions because of his definition of power as a natural, non-dialectical absolute definition very close to a bourgeois conception. The first contradiction can be solved by a concept of power as a dialectical absolute, a relation of forces, the second by recognizing that one needs not one instrument of mediation, but many continuous and punctual functions of the management of civil war. The Leninist notion of a single-party insurrection is today replaced by a concept of permanent civil war. Where Lenin drew a straight line of mediation from Spamanism to the Soviets through the party for an insurrection against autocracy, today, autonomy moves from the Sovietism of the masses to the self-organizing proletariat bf the extinction of work through a civil war against the contemporary form of bourgeois dictatorship. Autonomy consists of a plurality of points of organization, a plural mobilization of all legal and illegal kinds of struggle, the coordination of an entire molecular web, and the progressive accumulation of moments of encounter. The highest class consciousness today consists in the realization that power resides not in a representative or a delegate but in the class itself. Lenin's greatest limitation, according to Negri, is that it was impossible for him to show the struggle against the state as a struggle against work. Hegemony over development, as Lenin's socialist organization of work, is not yet liberation from development. But the highly developed level of the productive forces today means it is possible to move directly to communism, skipping an intermediate socialist stage and extinguishing the law of value once and for all. Whereas planning was a positive value for Lenin, today it is the first thing to be attacked, since it is simply a form of capitalist command. This need lays the ground for determining the significance of contemporary autonomy conceived as proletarian liberation born from the particularity of a subject, the autonomous particularity of its interests. Lenin's greatest contributions to revolutionary theory are the necessity of constructing organizations in terms of the political composition of the class, the location of revolutionary potential in a class subject capable of transforming reality, and the notion that the best method of revolution is that of the tendency as a theoretico-practical anticipation based on an analysis of the existing social formation. Class composition determines organization, although an underdeveloped class composition can mean that the relation must be inverted, as was the case in Russia. Proletarians and the State is Negri's critique of the CPI strategy of historical compromise with the Christian Democrats. He begins by describing the current crisis of the falling rate of profit and capital's restructuring in reaction to it. The major strategy of reaction is socialization, the extension of the command over labor into the domain of circulation. Command becomes the planning of crisis through money. But capitalist control fails in the face of stagflation. Energy and automation supply additional modes of control which help place capital beyond workers' struggles. But by far the most important means of control is the centralization of the world market. The multinational corporation disarticulates the unity of capital's control, and the state is replaced by the multinationals. Control is achieved through the world markets and money. Negri sees the historical compromise as an integral part of this capitalist restructuring of the relations of production. In the face of the autonomous refusal of work, the socialism of the compromise could only be repressive, since it is committed to the norm of capitalist development. The compromise assumes an ideology of work, of employment and of productive labor. It would exercise control over the crisis by the weapon of unemployment, thus isolating the workers from the proletariat, the factory from society, preventing the coming to unity of the proletariat. The new planning state, Negri says, would simply amount to workers' participation in the exploitation of workers. It rests on a mystification of the neutrality of the state as a mechanism which can be taken over. But, Negri argues, the state is in fact organic with capitalist development and the world market. There is no autonomy of the political of the sort preached by CPI theorists. Today, there is no such thing as civil society, a domain distinguishable from the political. Civil society has become subsumed to the state. Because of the irreducible antagonism between the state as the center of command for production and the proletarian force of social production, all revolutions from above within the state must necessarily be directed against the other pole, that is, the working class. Hence, now, class struggle must be directed against the state, and therefore, against reformism, inasmuch as reformism is part of the state. In the next section of Proletarium and the State, Negri describes the effects of the restructuring of capital on the working class. In response to the workers' struggles of the 60s, capital has restructured itself in order to gain more flexibility against labor and to reduce the cost of labor. Restructuring has taken the form of increased technical control and segmentation, the integration of individual and collateral enterprises, and the international reorganization of industry. All of this amounts to greater socialization, tertiarization, and flexibility. It has produced a separation of workers from unemployed, separation between enterprises, the proletarianization of the social strata of labor, the making unproductive of productive labor through tertiarization, the territorial decentralization of mass production, the introduction of capitalist production into all sectors of society, the destruction of all working class concentration, and reformism. but it has also meant the emergence of the social worker, as well as a new proletariat. Since the working class must always reverse the intention of capital, greater articulations, to counter division, must be sought. More and more, the movement must pass from a fight for wages to a fight for power over production. Now, the struggle becomes entirely political, and it moves against the state as the instance of command over production. The historic Corn Promise is part of this restructuring process. Negri calls the CPI the party of order and of work, a contention sustained by the party's support for the police state measures undertaken against the autonomy movement. Its public management would rationalize the relations of planned exploitation. The party acts against the needs of the working class, just as it did after the war and in 1968. Because the efforts of the class are inserted in an interclass scheme, the party's project can only be understood as benefiting capital's restructuring. The antagonism cannot be pacified, hence, today, the state is always repressive. Negri concludes that there can be no possible working class use of state institutions of the sort proposed by the CPR. In the following section, Negri describes a central point of the theory of autonomy, the elaboration of a politics based on labor and class composition. The passage from the mass worker to the social worker brings with it a new horizon of needs. But increased needs under the reign of exchange value merely increases the power of capital. Work labor is a use value which is not a reflection of exchange value. It is the only source of wealth independent of capital. The use value of labor as activity, force of production, and inventiveness is the opposite of exchange value. In the subordination of the use value of labor to exchange value, Negri sees the only possibility of rebellique. It is only through the use value of labor that one can subtract from capital its control over itself, so that capital becomes a use value for labor. Against the system of needs, then, is defined the system of struggle. When exploitation is strongest, insubordination becomes greatest. Labor is the only projective force which is opposed to the reigning productive relations. Set up PQIE, the dictatorship of exchange value is the hegemony of the useful particularity of living labor. This implies the possibility that labor can valorize itself against capital, moving from need to struggle. Class composition thus becomes the category of communist transition. The proletariat becomes the subject of the successful reappropriation of the productive forces by the class. The realization of enjoyment contains the possibility of revolution. It is important therefore that the composition tends toward organization. But, Negri cautions, the emerging party must be conceived not as a vanguard, but as the motor of transformation of a system of mass struggles, an organ for the mass reappropriation of power against wage labor, and as the invention of communism. It is in this context that the historic compromise's intention to retain wage labor must be understood. Struggle should instead move against any necessary labor through the wage. And the wage struggle tends to transform itself into a struggle for appropriation. Negri says that the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be understood outside such an appropriation. It does not mean a capitalism of the state. The CPI, he argues, opposes the dictatorship of the proletariat because it would imply the dissolution of th party into the legitimate materiality for generating workers' power. Autonomy, on the contrary, implies direct appropriation. The new class composition makes necessary a redefinition of the theme of mediation which underlies the exteriority of the Leninist party in relation to the class. Now, the antagonism is not mediated by delegation or by being delayed into the future. And the mediation of class consciousness is replaced by a directly collective and practical knowledge which is moving toward the construction of an alternative to capitalism. Consciousness is insinuated materially into reality, denying the mediation of abstract theory and reducing mediation to a tendential function. The historic compromise constitutes another form of mediation. Against this, proletarian action shifts the center away from the party. The only real pluralism is the plurality of the organizations of Workers' power and not the plurality of electoral parties crowding together into a single catch-all government. Working class recomposition focuses on the wage, but it leads to wider demands and objects which point toward the demand for a new mode of production. The manipulation of capital by labor through the refusal of work leads to a fundamental law of the transition to communism. It becomes possible when the working class subordinates capital to its actions, producing crises rather than economic development. The proletariat tends in its own actions to break the chains of reformist mediation. But repression is organic to capital, and the reformists, through the compromise, participate in repression. In addition, Negri argues that up against the power of multinational capital, the historic compromise would lose. Autonomy defines its tasks against the historic compromise. It emphasizes that the marginal disarticulation of labor produces new needs which are not reducible to those of wage labor. Against the capitalist image of separation and division, autonomy insists that all are exploited. In political terms, it acts against the institutions of capitalist command, and seeks to transform contradictions into antagonisms. It tries to show how all attempts at state solutions to the crisis of legitimation merely amount to an increase of exploitation. Autonomy is moving tendentially toward the organization of a party, but this can only be a party in action, without neutrality or mediation, and conceived as an accumulation of struggles. The road moves from practice to the theory of practice. Negri outlines 3 points of attack: the attack against wage labor, the destruction of the legitimacy of restructuration, and the preparation for the militant struggle against capital's use of force. He suggests a party form which would be the development of an effective directive function, but, he adds, only mass power can decide this directive capacity. The subtitle of the state form, Negri's next work for a critique of the political economy of the Constitution, indicates the direction the book takes in further undermining the CPI theory of civil society and of the autonomy of the political. The state form, particularly the Italian Constitution of 1948, is embedded in the capitalist economy. Therefore, it is not a neutral political mechanism which can be occupied by means of compromise. The state is a direct function of political economy, and it must be uncompromisingly attacked if capitalism is to be overcome. Negri begins with a consideration of the implications of the CPI's attempt to assume a place in the constitutional government. The phenomenon indicates the development of a new form of domination, the corporate state, which absorbs civil society into the state, following in the wake of a new form of worker insubordination. The workers' movement of the 60s was characterized by worker self-valorization against capital, the self-recognition of the mass worker, and the formation of the social worker. Since Negri assumes class composition to be fundamental, he sees the constitution of the state changing according to changes in class composition. The constitutional reaction to 68, for example, was the development of the crisis state. The need for a new concept of legitimation led to corporate co-determination between classes, the social democratic solution which saw the constitution and administration become direct functions of capital command. This meant that anyone opposing economic development was criminalized. The new constitutional reforms amount to exploitation with political legitimation. The critique of political economy is therefore necessarily a critique of administration, the constitution, and the state. All law relates to changes in social relations. In this light, the purpose of the 1948 Constitution was to disarm the working class. The CPI theory of civil society fails to grasp this relation. It does not realize that civil society cannot function outside the reproduction of capital. In consequence, Negri calls for a revolutionary function of theory to combat the Italian ideology with its concepts of hegemony, war of position, historic compromise, democratism, the autonomy of the political, the long march through the institutions, and the neutrality of the state. Negri does an exegesis of the Italian constitution which underscores the way it disarms the working class through rhetorical and conceptual manipulation. It terms Italy a democracy founded on labor, but this basis in productive labor is sublated into the terms of the bourgeoisie liberal economic development. Labor becomes a bourgeois category. By making social production out to be for the good of all, the Constitution suppresses class antagonism. The socialist obligation to work is thus related to democracy and equality by the bourgeoisie. Negri argues that this social state of the Constitution permits a resolution of the contradiction between the rationality of law and the irrationality of capitalist accumulation by substituting an integration of classes for economic self-regulation in the market. All of society becomes a medium of accumulation, a social factory. The material productivity of the law consists in the overcoming of struggle and conflict. This is the function of making labor the basis of social production. The subordination of labor is a condition of social organization and of capital accumulation. Capital wants to be the only wealth, but it is bound up with labor as the unique producer of wealth. This contradiction is overcome through the Constitution, which recognizes the valorization of labor, but simultaneously integrates it into capital through a social factory organization. However, to the concentration of capital necessarily corresponds a growth in workers' power. The Constitution seeks integration, but the increasing valorization and development of capitalism reproduces struggle on increasingly higher levels. This leads to a crisis of legality. Command then becomes the general exigency of economic development. The more capital is socialized, the greater adequation exists between law, the more imperative and consensus coalesce. The integration of labor into the Constitution implies a concomitant subordination. The socialist concept of the disappearance of the state here becomes the capitalist utopia of total consensus for the management of accumulation. The homogeneity of this corporate social factory would seem to be belied, however, by modern labor legislation, the necessity of which seems to betoken the inevitability of conflict. Capital is forced to recognize the necessity of its other and of conflict with it. The Constitution, then, seeks to substitute a norm of collective administration for open-ended contract negotiation. The purpose of the production of law to resolve conflicts is made clearer. It is born from an accord, and it reproduces it for the sake of organized production. Negri concludes by pointing out an aporia, or irresolvable contradiction, in the Constitution's assumptions about itself. If, as the Constitution implicitly acknowledges, labor is the general origin of value and of social production, and if the Constitution presents itself as a general science, that is, as law, then the fact of labor legislation cannot be written off as a merely particular episode. It relates to the general level, and what it indicates against the corporatist mystification of the Constitution's claim to social integration is the necessity of contradiction and of class conflict. Negri relates this aporia to changing class composition. When the Constitution was written, the mass worker, the subject of autonomy, had not yet been created by capitalist production. Hence, it was still possible to imagine a social order based on collective contracts. The solution to the aporia is the social planning state. Negri plots its emergence in this way. Capital moves toward a general model of abstraction, which includes the complete alienation of labor on the social level. The capitalist project always responds to contestation and seeks its overcoming. Hence, the massification of abstract labor is perennially threatened by its transformation into a totality of content, of living labor force, as opposed to the abstract labor capital requires in its mass production base. To the massification of the formal intensity of the unification of economic development in the capitalist model must correspond unavoidably a maximum of unification of the labor force. The Constitution tries to ignore the insubordination of labor. Labor appears in the Constitution as abstract, as a formal moment in social production, without any analysis of the concrete conditions of production. The formalism of the Constitution operates an a priori elimination of the accidentality labor contestation might introduce into the abstract generality of the constitutional model of social production in a social state. The problem is that in passing from the formal unification of the Constitution to the functional effectivity of unification in reality, Conflicts have to be recognized which contradict the formality of the legal system. The abstract unifies, the concrete separates. And the more the concrete separates, the more there is a tendency in capital toward the unification of abstract labor. But equally, abstract labor necessarily indicates revolt and insubordination in relation to capital. The question then is how to restore the totality which the abstract formal generality of constitutional law afforded. Capital, Negri argues, makes use of the very mobility of labor which opposes it. It recognizes the right of labor and of unions, and in this way, it resolves conflicts. The formal constitutional model of corporate social production can be realized only as a negation of a negation. The positive result is the social planning state which assures accumulation, realizes the abstract model, orients the entire activity of social normativity, and affirms the unicity of the labor force in determining the process of valorization. The planning state completes the constitutionalization of labor. It makes labor the basis of the social state through planning and ordering for a total process. Through a dialectical mediation, continuity is achieved, contestation and conflict are eliminated. And it shows that beyond consensus lies power. There is, then, an antinomy between abstract and concrete labor, between formal integration and substantive conflict. The Constitution must be understood as operating against the desire to attack the social totality based on labor. Only authority can guarantee the working of the formal model. This is the function of juridical science which, in the service of imperativism, lends normativity to the interests of capital. The role of the Constitution in all this is to guarantee the continuity in society which capital requires. The possibility of civil war must be reduced. All conflict must be resolved in favor of economic development. The contradiction of abstract and concrete labor is mediated by the transcendence of the state. But the unity of the state can be turned inside out, then, there exists only the irreducible contradiction of the two forms of labor. Negri concludes that the bourgeois world is dialectical and integrative, while the world of workers' struggles is not, because it depends on keeping the contradiction open. In another chapter of the state form, Negri takes issue with Pashukansis' theory of law and the Bolshevik theory of transition. It is another crucial moment in the development of the theory of autonomy. He argues that law is not superstructural. In the form of law, the command of capital as exploitation is exercised. There is, then, a direct link between law and surplus value. Law is the form of relation between the organization and command of exploitation. As violence and command, it is necessary for production. The relations of production are produced by law. This means, however, that at the moment when an identity of law and command seems to be attained, the antagonism implicit in capitalist social relations expresses itself. Law is therefore both the identity of authority and the first line of crisis. In relation to this antagonism within the unity of capitalist society, law becomes general domination. There is no proletarian law. Therefore, in the transition to communism, law founded on antagonism will become extinct. The state of law will no longer be possible. Negri criticizes Bolsheviks for conceiving of the transition in terms of a mere socialization of property, a replacement of the relations of the market with relations of the organization of social property, of social work. This is not enough. Workers' struggles must move against the basis of property itself, the law of work value, the regulator of exploitation. Property is nothing more than determinate concentration of capitalist command, of the enforcement of the law of value. At this point, Negri cites a highly significant passage in Marx. The suppression of private property is thus realized only when it is conceived as the suppression of work. An organization of work is therefore a contradiction. In Pashukansis, law is saved by the myth of social work which exists outside the process of valorization. But, Negri counters, the work process and the valorization process cannot be separated. In the transition, law cannot be separated from exploitation. The communists struggle against work and the state must also be against law as the specific authoritative form of the relation between the state and organized labor. At this point, Negri once again takes up the Communist Party theory of state monopoly capitalism in order to demonstrate its political paucity. The theory pitches civil society against the monopoly state in favor of democracy as a defense against fascism. The theory fails to see the complete process of the social reproduction of capitalism. Instead, it concentrates on specific areas like science and technology. The only goal it can project is the restoration of the rationality of capitalist development - socialism purged of the monopoly deviation. In this scenario, the workers' struggle against exploitation is marginalized. The Marxist alternative, Negri argues, sees the state as being integral with capitalist exploitation and accumulation. The state is not separate from production, and the planning state in particular is necessary for capitalist valorization. Stomokop misses this point, fetishizes civil society, and substitutes a struggle in circulation for the struggle against wage labor. The relative autonomy of the state is nothing more than the continuity and permanence of capitalist command. In planning, objectified command becomes a part of the labor process, and the capitalist machine becomes political through and through. Negri goes on to argue that one form of state control public expenditure, the social wage, can be used by workers against the state. By increasing the quantity of needs and the level of demands, a point of qualitative explosion, a fiscal crisis of the state, can be reached. Economic attacks of this sort are immediately political because they are against the state organization of the relation between consensus and production. Consensus is an internal function of the relations of production. Mutations in legitimation have led to an increased role of the state, as a response to the falling rate of profit. The state becomes directly productive through the oligopolistic investment of public expenditure. This helps the accumulation of social capital, and productivity is the legitimating term of the complete process. But a gap opens between the productivity of business and the real terrain of accumulation, and this becomes a space for struggle through the reduction of productivity and the accentuation of the dysfunctions of the social accumulation of the capital state. Both the work wage and the social wage become potentially destructive. But this struggle requires a recognition of society as a factory and of the state as a boss, as well as a breaking of the fetish of productivity as a weapon of legitimation. Instead, legitimation must be referred to the complete needs of the proletariat. In terms of the tendency of class struggle to move against the state, Negri criticizes Gramsci's notion of hegemony and the use the CPI makes of it in promoting calls for alliances and compromise. Hegemony is in fact subsumed under the capitalist command for profit, which makes civil society into a project of the productive process and of the structure of power. Civil society is dead, it is assumed into capitalist development and the social unity of productive labor. On the other hand, Negri sees the struggle for radical democracy, against the increasingly authoritarian nature of consensus, as a fundamental matter of class struggle, because such struggle affects the relation between necessary labor and surplus value. Negri views Italian socialism as the utopian subsumption of social labor into capital, as itself a moment in class struggle. It merely raises to a higher level the new antagonism between labor and capital. It is at this higher level today that subjectivity becomes the key to the process of communist prefiguration. As the increasing demand for wages, the reappropriation of work time, auto-reductions, resistance, and appropriation, the consciousness of class manifests itself as the immediate recuperation of the wealth of labor. Appropriation thus liquidates the socialist mediation of social domination. The Marxist theory of the state, then, consists of the imputation of a tendency to a revolutionary subject. It centers on the necessary transformation of productive relations. Negri calls for a dictatorship of the proletariat which he defines in terms of a radical transformation of the law of value. Unlike bourgeois democracy, which is merely the shell of capitalist domination over the working class, this dictatorship can only be the capacity of the masses to manage their own power. This does not exist in the East, where there is instead a dictatorship of the party bureaucracy. The law of value still obtains in the USSR, and the working class there is used to increase social productivity. Negri concludes the state form with a chapter whose subtitle is Toward a Critique of the Material Constitution, Worker Self-Valorization and the Party Hypothesis. He argues that two forces act against capitalist Div 1. Opment based on co-management between capital and the parties and unions of the working class, the social dimension and the emancipatory quality of the labor force. These two forces demonstrate that exchange is inadequate to put the collective power of socially cooperating labor in action. Only communist production, beyond the law of value, can realize the full potential of productive labor. The Constitution of 1948 was founded on the social organization of value, conflictuality, and exchange. But the Constitution collapses around the failure of the law of value due to the growth and rigidity of necessary labor through capitalist socialization. The class refusal of work defines modes of worker self-valorization in reproduction which disturb the proportion required for the law of value to function. The solution is command and co-management. The restored corporate form mystifies the breakup of the Constitution and stabilizes capital. As capital becomes socialized, reproduction becomes a sphere of antagonism and struggle. Capital's dependence on the reproduction of the worker opens the possibility of the relative independence of the needs, consumption, and use values of the working class in response to capitalist development. The process of reproduction, which subsumes circulation, presents conditions for antagonism, for a manifestation of the independence of the working class. Circulation is reduced to production, but this means that it also is contaminated by the antagonisms of production. Negri believes it is possible to break reproduction. This is the role of the other workers' movement. Because of the autonomous quality of this movement, capital loses the possibility of neutrality, democratic containment, and the quantitative weapon of the wage. It must become repressive. The form repression takes is public administration. New constitutional forms, ones which function as factory enterprise command, are required today because only an open affirmation of inequality can overcome the crisis. Since the state subsumed civil society, the working class is no longer part of civil society. The other workers' movement constructs in itself its own society. There is no longer an exchange between labor and capital. Its place is taken by command. Negri ends the state form by calling for the organization of the diverse self-valorizing autonomous workers' struggles into a party. If the state is the party of capital, then the party is the state of the working class. The essence of the party is the subjectivity of the class, and it accumulates workers' actions until they culminate in a qualitative leap to power. Breakdown is never automatic, only workers' struggles channeled by a party can bring it about. The task of the party is to centralize the various proletarian sectors in a project for wages which spreads the base of struggle for a complete reappropriation of social productivity. Negri was unjustly imprisoned as a terrorist, despite his written criticisms of terrorism. In light of this accusation, it is interesting to note the tactics he privileges in the state form, throwing nuts into machinery as a part of general factory sabotage, delaying the production line, urban guerrillas without guns, the Yusuf laws, takeovers, and squatting. In short, legality as a weapon. In Domination and Sabotage, Negri defines autonomy as a dual project, destruct for ration of the economic system and destabilization of the political regime. This dual project provokes an effort at restructuration on the part of capital which aims at an elimination of the antagonistic element in the working C=less. But the working class tends to separate itself from the process of capitalist development, to refuse capitalist valorization and to engage instead in self-valorization, which Negri defines here as the form power assumes in an advanced workerist position, the global, mass, productive figuration of a project of insurrection for the abolition of the state. The personal is polycolonial, in that proletarian self-love merges with class hatred. Negri formulates his argument in terms of the thematic of discontinuity which has been effulgent way into Italy from France in the 70s. Whereas the orthodox dialectic, which provides a basis for Communist Party thinking, operates in terms of homology, totality, and resolution, the philosophy of discontinuity emphasis, lay non-homologous otherness or heterogeneity, the fractured and incomplete nature of totality, and the impossibility of full resolution. It is in MP.Y ways the philosophic equivalent of autonomy and is in France associate D with the names of Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard. Negri writes that it is only by insisting on his difference and otherness, and on the otherness of the class movement, that there can be ruptures of the sort that provide hope for renewal. The workers' movement is discontinuous, it is continuously remaking itself by destroying its old organizational forms, QY defining itself as other than the totality of capitalist development. The movement operates a destructuration sabotage of it. There can be no homology between the movement and capitalist development. The totality of capitalism is thus seen as a forced relationship, it is structured by a destructuration which is the product of the proletarian subject. The purpose of capitalist restructuration is to reimpose conclusiveness on this destructuration, but working class self-valorization is irreducibly discontinuous. It has nothing to do with the homologies of rationalist or historicist progressivism. As autonomy, it refuses the goal of economic development. The rupture and recognition of the class-owned productive force removes any possibility of a resolutive dialectic. Capitalist power resides in the simultaneity of the processes and reproduction, whereas for the proletariat it means developing the independence of its own processes of reproduction, its dissymmetry, its discontinuity. Negri calls for a linkage between wage struggles and the struggle for public expenditures as part of a program destined to disrupt the simultaneity of production and reproduction. This would develop the of productive labor against the attempt by capital to divide workers from other proletarian sectors. Negri argues that the unemployed must oppose the arrogance of salaried income, the privileged position of the factory, and the wage must be extended to include the majority of proletarians. If, as Negri believes, the proletarian movement represents the extreme dissolution of the concept of power, then within the movement, the wage struggle must become political, general, and egalitarian. It must act principally on the terrain of public spending, for the self-valorization of the overall reproduction of the entire proletar. Negri returns to the problem of autonomous organization. He defines the party as a function of proletarian power, a guarantor of the process of self-valorization, and an army that defends the frontiers of the independence of the proletariat. Only working class self-valorization, however, can exercise the logic of separation, and this is the sole source of proletarian power. Negri points out that whenever in history the party becomes uppermost, the revolution is finished. In autonomy, power dissolves into a network of powers, only a diffuse network of powers can organize revolutionary democracy. The independence of the class is to be constructed via the autonomy of single, individual revolutionary movements. Unity will be the product of moments of power which are pluralistic. For the question of violence is fundamental, as the immediate refusal of work, the inducement of capitalist crisis through the class reappropriation of the mechanisms of its own reproduction, and the eventual exclusion of the enemy. To waylay hasty accusations of totalitarianism, it should be pointed out that Negri also speaks here of democracy and freedom as necessary components of self-valorization, whose object is the total use of wealth in the service of collective freedom. The bourgeoisie excludes violence even as it practices it. For Negri, the only way to overcome the violence of history is to acknowledge its. Negri concludes this book on a note of optimism. The balance of power, he contends, has been reversed, the working class is now the stronger power. The more the form of domination itself, the more empty it becomes, the more working class refusal grows and becomes full of rationality and value. And the goal of refusal is to unleash the proletariat's productive potential, which is now constrained by capitalist domination. Marx beyond Marx is the most comprehensive statement of the theory of autonomy. One point that Negri makes that is necessary to bear in mind in order to understand his next book on Spinoza is that communism is immediately given in inverted form in the categories of capital. For example, the specific characteristics of money can be immediately reversed into communism. Capitalist development is the inverse image of the process of communism, as a radical and extreme antithesis. When the opposition becomes extreme, then associated labor will be transformed. The emergence of an antithetical subject and the liberation of the forces of production will legislate that capitalist command is no longer necessary. There will be new rules of production and development. The two most important features of Negri's communism are first, that it is the result of the activity of a constituting subject, and second, that it consists of the liberty of this subject's labor from the capitalist form of value and of work. The communist future can only be constructed, it is not the product or teleology of capitalism's logical development, but rather a new subject forming itself by destroying capital and transforming reality. The communist refusal of work unleashes the multiplicity of free movement of this subject, its complete autonomy. But what is necessary to SF.E is that this multiplicity and potential over productivity is already contained in capitalism. Communism, as a dynamic and constitutive subjective element, human productive potential, is the motor of capitalist development. This is why Negri is so optimistic. The materialization of communism will thus consist of the development of the use values of living labor beyond the limits capital value imposes. The transition to communism is the material self-construction of an autonomous subject. At first glance, The Savage Anomaly, Essay on Power and Potential in Baruch Spinoza, the study of Spinoza which Negri wrote while in prison, seems to mark a radical break from his preceding works. In it, he returns to the analysis of 17th-century politics and philosophy which was his concern in Descartes' Politico, before he undertook a more engaged form of writing. Yet Savage Anomaly is not all that anomalous. In it, Negri constructs a reading of Spinoza which justifies his own political and philosophical position. Negri reads Spinoza as privileging potential against power. One can see immediately how this relates to Negri's notion of communism as the liberation of human collective productive capacity from the law of value and capitalist work, two forms of power. Potential is the materialist production and constitution of being in Spinoza. It also names collective human activity as a world-constituting practice. Potential has both an ontological and a political dimension, and the two necessarily articulate. Ontologically, it describes the constitutive collective practice that produces the world as an open-ended dynamic activity. The collectivity is the multitudes, and the activity is progressive liberation. Politically, therefore, potential is the basis of a revolutionary democracy, constituted by consensus. By interweaving the concepts of material production and political constitution, Spinoza demystifies the philosophical basis of the 17th-century bourgeois absolute state, that is, the rational idealist dualism of mind and body, mind and world. Elevated, like the mind, above the world of material production, the state becomes transcendental command and power, beyond determination by the collective practice of the masses. It is for this reason that Negri will argue that Spinoza's political theory is actually to be found in his metaphysics. The metaphysical concept of potential in a non-dualist materialist philosophy necessarily leads to an ethics of need, passion, and generosity, as well as to a politics of republican constitution and liberation. Hence, Negri argues, Spinoza puts the problem of democracy on a material basis, within the problem of production and against all the current mystifications of the state. He is anomalous in relation to the new 17th century capitalist order of production because his work represents the transgression of all ordering which is not freely constituted by the masses. His new rationality consists of a constitutional ontology founded on needs and the organization of the collective imagination. Philosophy and politics, therefore, like constitution and production, are inseparable in Spinoza. The fact that the writing of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a political tract, interrupts the writing of the Ethics, a philosophical document, is not an accident as far as Negri is concerned. It simply shows that the activity of discovery mimes the discovery of activity. I will discuss only those parts of the book which relate to the theory of autonomy. I won't enter into historical or textual detail. It is enough to say that Negri has performed a fine materialist and historical analysis. He describes the development of Spinoza's work in terms of the political economy of the Dutch Republic, the cultural milieu of the Counter-Reformation, and Spinoza's own perambulations. And he outlines an antagonistic dual tradition of political theory Hobbes/Rousseau Hegel vs. Machiavelli Spinozal Marx, which clearly is pertinent to the current situation in Italy. For Negri, Spinoza is a post-bourgeois philosopher who writes against the grain of the ideological requirements of the Dutch bourgeoisie. Rather than a utopia which merely idealizes the capitalist market in the face of a crisis, Spinoza writes a dystopia which acknowledges the practical material basis of human life in need and desire, the convictuality which is the consequence of this basis, and the collectivity of human production which is the only possible ethical solution to that convictuality. Spinoza is radically anti-transcendental. His method follows the diffuse expansion of material potential rather than taking the form of a finalist, teleological dialectic, which mediates difference, conflict, and the plurality of modes of being into an abstract resolution which would be the identity of power. Potential is always at odds with power in Spinoza. The power of dialectical mediation subsumes the individual into the universal. The emphasis on potential reverses this transcendental metaphysic by promoting an insertion into the world, an exaltation of the plurality of modes, in politics, history, and in the phenomenology of singular and collective life. Spinoza's logic follows the constitutive process of reality. It posits material being as potenza, activity, a construction, within which human productive activity is situated. The political implication of the emphasis on human production as potential is that it opposes the subsumption of that activity into a principle of transcendence, of power. Political society will not be based on obedience, but rather on consensus. For Spinoza, the state is not founded on law, but instead on liberation, which is equatable with constitution, the free expansion of human productive potential. The notion of potential is subversive of power because it implies an open-endedness and a counter-finality of constitution and production which foregrounds the principles of displacement and transformation, both of which undermine the bases of power instability and absolutism. Philosophical finalism always makes a historical world order out to be of the indissoluble order of nature, hence, it legitimates power and command. Spinoza's concept of the human being as an activity, as a subject of construction and the producer of the world, dislocates any finality assigned to a particular world order. The horizon of human constitutive potential is open, the world is what is not yet. This, according to Negri, is what makes Spinoza an anomaly in terms of the dominant culture of the 17th century. With its emphasis on the collectivity of the multitude, and its opposition to the rigid individualism of the capitalist market, Spinoza's metaphysic is a declaration of the irreducibility of the forces of production to the bourgeois order. It is an affirmation of the productive force of humankind and a demystification of all bourgeois ideology which hides domination exercised over that productive force. As in Negri's other writings on the problem of the antagonism between capitalist command and worker autonomy, the problem of the crossing between productive force and productive relation appears here as crucial in Spinoza. There is no possibility of a separation of productive relations from productive forces. He negates the distinction between civil society and the state. Civil society and politics are completely interwoven. This argument has two important consequences which set off echoes in the theory of autonomy. The first is that the 17th century order of capitalist development, as a result of economic crises, required an ideology of ascesis and ordering which placed limits on productive accumulation. Spinoza's philosophy of potential as an infinite activity of constructive production which remained open counters this bourgeois necessity. The limitlessness of potential is posed against the limitations imposed by power. The second consequence is that power can only be determined as subordinate to the social potential of the multitude. The collapsing of the distinctions between civil society and politics, productive forces and productive relations, in Spinoza implies that state power can only be constitutionally organized. This represents a negation of the absolutist state, of the separation of state of capitalist original accumulation from society, and an espousal of a constitution founded on opposition to power and the affirmation of autonomy. The modernity of Spinoza's concept of the political constitution of the real resides in its destruction of the notion of the autonomy of the political and an affirmation of the hegemony and autonomy of the collective needs of the masses. Spinoza's metaphysic, then, presents being as a productive force and ethics as the phenomenological articulation of productive needs. It affirms productive forces as a terrain of liberation, much like the theory of autonomy. In Spinoza, as in the theory of autonomy, production and constitution, collective human productive activity and the political arrangement of society, are presented as inseparable. Production is inside the structure of being, and human activity extends nature by transforming it into second nature, something produced by humankind. The political constitution in Spinoza is what mediates the passage from nature to second nature. Therefore, according to Negri, it is the productive machinery of the destruction of power, conceived as transcendence and control over the productive masses. In this frame, power is seen as contingent in relation to the truly constitutive principle of the world, which is potential. The legitimation of command is based on the separation of the relation between relations of production and forces of production, and in Spinoza such a separation cannot obtain. Productive force, once liberated from the constraints of bourgeois productive relations, shows itself to be immediately constitutive, and it shows the possibility that the world can be transformed according to desire. And this last, one might say, is the conclusion of the theory of autonomy. As Negri words it in his political writings, communism as a minimal program. The first major political piece that Negri published in prison is entitled Class Politics, Motor and Form, the 5 Campaign Today. It is an appendix to a forthcoming book to be called War and Communism. He calls for a critical reassessment of the 70s. He repudiates the Red Brigade's strategy of armed terrorism, blaming it for the current straits in which the movement finds itself. He argues that a new level of class composition has been attained which calls for a new class politics that would be the conscious mediation of the constitutive activity of the proletarian practice of needs. The period of pure auto-valorization is over, and now is a time requiring auto-determination through a political mediation of the movement. Hence, the 5th campaign he outlines calls for the formation of a political stratum for the direction of the communist movement, the strategic definition of its functions, and the political mediation of the class struggle. Once again arguing for the refusal of work and for the constitutive communist potential of the proletariat within capitalism, Negri emphasizes that this political mediation must grow directly out of the class activity. The taking of power can only be the form of this material. The seizure of state power alone, without an anchor in the composition of the class, merely reproduces the bourgeois autonomization of the political, places the vanguard before the mass, and leads to socialism as planned capitalism. Negri's argument is characteristically optimistic. The crisis, he writes, must be made the key to reconstructing the movement. It should not be seen as a catastrophe, but rather, as a source of creativity. Once one sees the possibility of communism in the crisis, then peace itself, not armed struggle, becomes a weapon against capitalist development. The revolutionary passage can only grow out of the long, material process of the class composition of the proletariat. That composition has now reached a higher level that requires a higher level of political mediation, not that of the microgroups of the 70s, but one that is more unitary in character, not a party, but a political mediation of counterpower that would translate the constitutive mobility of the class subject into a political mobility. Of the two traditional options which offer themselves now as possible strategies, tyrannicide or the right of resistance, Negri chooses resistance, destruction through mass insubordination, rejecting the brigade's brand of tyrannicide. Collective revolt, he argues, will constitute communism. The political struggle comes NRST, and it assumes the immediacy of needs as an essential moment in the revolutionary passage. And there is a political need in the proletariat for wealth and liberty that is not answered by either the brigade's terrorism or the CPR's statist alternative. Negri concludes by listing the 5 campaigns that are needed today. First, the struggle against work as the exercise of counterpower and as the imminence of communism. Second, the fight over public expenditures for services that affect the proletariat's reproduction of itself. Third, the nuclear struggle and the critique of science as power. Fourth, the struggle against the authoritarian state through education and the construction of a mass front. And finally, the creation of a political stratum for directing the movement. At a time of great pessimism in the Italian movement, Negri still sees grounds for hope within oppression. Every suture, he writes, opens new wounds.